I called hello to the canyon, and something called back with better pronunciation. Bear Lake Basin sits at 11,000 feet in the Colorado Rockies, accessible only by a 12-mile trail that gains 4,000 feet of elevation through some of the most remote wilderness in the state. I'd planned this trip for months, waiting for the weather window between summer storms and early snow. The hike in took most of Saturday, heavy pack loaded with 4 days of supplies and cold weather gear. By the time I crested the final ridge and saw the lake spread out below, the sun was already dropping behind the western peaks. Perfect campsite weather, clear skies, light wind from the southwest, temperature dropping into the 30s, but nothing my gear couldn't handle. I found a protected spot about 50 yards from the lakeshore, flat ground with good drainage and a windbreak from a cluster of ancient spruces. Standard routine. Pitched the tent, hung my food bag high enough to frustrate any bears, got the white gas stove set up for dinner. The lake was mirror still, reflecting the surrounding peaks so perfectly you couldn't tell where the mountains ended and their reflections began. As I cooked dinner, I tested the acoustics the way you do in big country. Called out toward the far shore, listened to my voice bounce back from the granite walls that ring the basin. Hello. Clean echo came back about 3 seconds later. Hello. Same volume, same tone. Exactly what you'd expect from a mountain lake surrounded by cliff faces. I tried a few more calls while the pasta water boiled. Testing. Beautiful evening. Anyone out there? Each time, perfect acoustic response. The canyon walls sent back exactly what I'd given them, with that slight hollow quality you get from long-distance echoes. After dinner, I was cleaning up when I decided to try one more call, just because the acoustics were so clear. Good night, Colorado. 3-second delay. Then, good night, Colorado. But something was different about the echo. Clearer pronunciation, better enunciation. Like someone had taken my words and cleaned them up before sending them back. I tried again. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Return call. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Definitely improved. The echo came back with more precise consonants, better breath control. Like I'd been coached by a speech therapist in the 3 seconds it took my voice to travel across the basin and back. Probably just acoustic effects I didn't understand. Mountain geography can do strange things to sound, especially in high country, where the air is thin and the rock formations create complex reflection patterns. But I decided to test it systematically. My name is Kevin Torres. 3-second pause then. My name is Kevin Torres. Perfect diction. Every syllable crystal clear. Better than my original pronunciation, which tends to slur slightly when I'm tired from hiking. I tried something more complex. I'm camping alone at Bear Lake Basin in Colorado. The echo came back flawless, not just repeating my words, but delivering them with improved clarity and rhythm, like someone was translating my casual speech into a more polished version. Around 9 p.m., I tried an experiment. Instead of calling out loud, I just thought the words clearly. Can you hear this? 3-second delay, then from across the water. Can you hear this? My voice, but spoken aloud. Whatever was creating the echo wasn't just reflecting sound waves. It was somehow accessing my thoughts and giving them voice. I thought another phrase. This is impossible. Across the basin, this is impossible. Perfect pronunciation, delivered in my voice, but with better technique than I actually possess. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with acoustic phenomena. I started testing the limits, thought complex sentences, tried phrases in different languages, even attempted some technical terminology from my work as a software engineer. Every thought came back as polished speech. French phrases I barely remembered from college returned with native-level pronunciation. Technical terms I usually stumble over came back smooth and professional. Whatever was out there wasn't just reading my mind. It was improving on my communication skills. Around 10 p.m., I tried something that changed everything. Instead of random phrases, I thought, "Who are you?" Long pause, longer than the usual 3 seconds. Then, from the darkness across the lake, "Who are you?" But the voice that came back wasn't quite mine anymore. Same general tone, same pitch, but with subtle differences in inflection and timing. Like someone doing a very good impression of my voice, but not getting all the details exactly right. I thought, "Show yourself." Another long pause, then, "Show yourself." The voice was drifting further from my own, still recognizably based on my speech patterns, but with variations that made it clear someone else was doing the talking. Around midnight, the moon broke through some high clouds I hadn't noticed gathering. Silver light illuminated the basin, bright enough to see details across the water. I could make out individual trees, rock formations, the far shore where my voice had been coming from. But I could also see that one of my tent guy lines had been retied. I'm particular about knots, always use the same configurations, but the guy line on the lake side of my tent was tied with a trucker's hitch instead of my usual bow line. Professional work, perfectly functional, but not my technique. Someone had been at my campsite while I was focused on the voice across the water. I checked the rest of my gear by moonlight. Food bag still secure, but positioned slightly differently than I'd left it. Backpack still in the tent vestibule, but oriented toward the lake instead of away from it. Small changes, easy to miss unless you paid close attention to details. I tried one more thought experiment. "I know you're here." This time the response came from much closer. Not across the lake, but from maybe 30 feet away, near the tree line behind my tent. "I know you're here." Definitely not my voice anymore. Close approximation, but with an artificial quality like computer-generated speech that's almost but not quite human. The creosote smell hit me then. Sharp and medicinal. The scent of desert plants that had no business growing at 11,000 feet in the Colorado Rockies. But there it was, cutting through the clean mountain air like a warning. I packed by moonlight. Didn't bother with the usual careful routine, just stuffed everything into the pack and prepared for a night hike back to the trailhead. Some situations call for strategic retreat. As I broke camp, I could hear my voice coming from different positions around the basin. Not echoes anymore, but conversation fragments. Things I'd thought but never spoken aloud. Beautiful country up here. Perfect weather for backpacking. Nobody else around for miles. All delivered in variations of my voice, but from sources that were definitely not acoustic reflections. I started hiking out around 1 a.m., headlamp beam cutting through the darkness. The trail was clear enough to follow, and I knew the route well from the afternoon ascent. But as I climbed back toward the ridge, I could hear the voices following. Always in my voice, always about 30 seconds behind, commenting on my progress like a hiking partner who stayed just out of sight. Trail steeper than I remembered. Good thing I brought the headlamp. Should reach the parking area by sunrise. All accurate observations, all things I was thinking as I hiked, but spoken aloud by something that had learned to use my voice better than I could myself. By the time I reached my truck at dawn, the voices had stopped. I threw my pack in the back, drove straight home without stopping for breakfast or rest. But I kept thinking about that improved pronunciation and the way my thoughts had become speech without passing through my own mouth. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the Forest Service. Another backpacker had reported hearing voices at Bear Lake Basin, someone calling out in perfect pronunciation despite being alone in the wilderness. They'd organized a search, thinking someone might be lost or injured. Found no one, but they did discover something interesting. The area around the lake showed signs of recent activity. Multiple campsites, all in the same spot I'd used. Gear impressions in the earth, fire rings that had been carefully concealed, even some modern equipment that didn't belong to any registered backcountry permits. Someone had been using that basin regularly, and they'd gotten very good at hiding their presence from casual visitors. The ranger mentioned one more detail that stuck with me. They'd found voice recordings hidden in the trees around the lake. Professional equipment, solar-powered, designed to capture and replay human speech. But when they played back the recordings, all they heard were conversations in languages none of them recognized. Complex, flowing speech that sounded almost human, but with pronunciation too perfect to be natural. Like something had been practicing human speech patterns, using visitors' voices as training material. I never went back to Bear Lake Basin, but sometimes I catch myself listening to my own voice, checking to see if my pronunciation has improved without my noticing. Old habits from a place where something was learning to speak by copying the people who passed through. The conveyor belt was pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. Dearborn Assembly operates 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, building mid-sized trucks for the North American market. I worked night maintenance there, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Tuesday through Saturday. Good union job with solid benefits, and I liked the methodical nature of keeping complex machinery running smoothly. The main assembly line stretched almost half a mile through the plant, a continuous conveyor system that moved truck frames through dozens of stations, where robots and human workers installed everything from engines to door handles. During production, the line ran at a steady 12 feet per minute, precise and constant. But on Sundays, during scheduled downtime, we'd run the empty conveyor at reduced speed for maintenance checks. Standard procedure: walk alongside the moving belt, checking for worn bearings, loose chains, anything that might cause problems during the production week. November 15th, I was doing routine conveyor inspection when I first noticed the rhythm change. I was walking station 7 to station 12, checking belt tension and listening for unusual sounds. The conveyor was running at its normal maintenance speed, maybe 3 feet per minute. Steady mechanical pulse, same as always. But as I walked, I started noticing the belt speed wasn't quite constant. Subtle variations in the rhythm, moments where it would speed up slightly, then slow down, almost like the conveyor was breathing. I checked the control panel. Settings showed steady 3.2 feet per minute, no programmed variations. But the belt definitely had a rhythm that didn't match the mechanical settings. Around midnight, I realized what I was hearing. The conveyor was pulsing in sync with my heartbeat. When I stopped walking and stood still, listening to my pulse, the belt rhythm matched exactly, about 72 beats per minute, with the same slight variations that come from natural cardiac rhythm. I tested it, walked quickly for 30 seconds to raise my heart rate, then stood still and listened. The conveyor speed increased to match my elevated pulse, then gradually slowed back to resting rate as my heartbeat returned to normal. The machinery was somehow monitoring my biological functions and adjusting its operation accordingly. I called the control room, asked if anyone was remotely adjusting the line speed. "Negative," came the reply. "Systems on automatic maintenance cycle. Speed should be constant at 3.2 feet per minute. I'm seeing variations down here. Belt speeding up and slowing down. I'll check the programming. Might be a glitch in the control software." But 20 minutes later, control called back with more questions than answers. "System shows steady 3.2 feet per minute on all monitoring equipment. No speed variations recorded. You sure you're seeing changes?" I was sure. The conveyor was definitely matching my heart rate, adjusting in real time as my pulse changed. I decided to test it more systematically. Did jumping jacks for 2 minutes to get my heart rate up around 120 beats per minute, then stood next to the conveyor and listened. The belt speed had increased proportionally. Instead of the lazy 3.2 feet per minute maintenance pace, it was moving at maybe 5.5 feet per minute. Still well within normal operational parameters, but definitely faster. As my heart rate returned to normal over the next few minutes, the conveyor speed decreased in perfect synchronization. Around 2 a.m. I discovered the modifications. While checking the drive mechanism at Station 15, I found a small electronic device mounted inside the motor housing. Sophisticated piece of equipment with wireless antennas and what looked like a biometric sensor. The device was warm to the touch and humming quietly. Fresh installation. The mounting screws were bright and new, and there were clean tool marks on the housing where someone had done recent work. I took photos, documented the location, then continued the maintenance inspection. Found similar devices at stations 8, 12, and 19. All recently installed, all actively monitoring something. But what bothered me was the reflective tags we used to mark critical maintenance points. They'd been repositioned, moved from their normal locations to form patterns that seemed to correspond with the biometric device placement. Like someone had been mapping the maintenance routes and installing monitoring equipment at optimal observation points. I called my supervisor, reported the unauthorized modifications. "I'll send someone down to look," he said. But maintenance isn't scheduled to install any new monitoring equipment on the line. Those devices shouldn't be there. While I waited for backup, I continued the inspection. But now I was paying attention to more than just the conveyor system. The overhead cranes were cycling their movements to match my breathing rhythm. The ventilation fans were adjusting their speed based on how quickly I was walking. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to be dimming and brightening in sync with some biological function I couldn't identify. The entire factory was somehow tuned to my presence. Around 4 a.m. my supervisor arrived with a team from electrical maintenance. They examined the devices I'd found, took photos, ran diagnostics on the control systems. "This is professional work," the electrical supervisor said. "Whoever installed these knew exactly what they were doing. The devices are integrated into the existing control systems, drawing power from the main circuits." "What are they monitoring?" "Looks like biometric data. Heart rate, respiratory patterns, maybe even stress hormones if the sensors are sophisticated enough." "Why would someone want to monitor that?" "Good question. This equipment isn't in any of our maintenance records. Someone installed it without authorization. They decided to remove the devices immediately, but when the first one was disconnected, something unexpected happened. The entire assembly line shut down. Not a normal shutdown, an emergency stop that triggered alarms throughout the plant. Red lights flashing, klaxons sounding, automated systems going into safety mode. It took 20 minutes to restart the line, and when they tried to remove the second device, the same thing happened. The devices are integrated deeper than we thought, the supervisor explained. They're not just monitoring the system, they're part of the control loop. Removing them triggers safety shutdowns. So we can't take them out, not without a complete system reprogramming. That's a week-long job, minimum. They decided to leave the devices in place until engineering could develop a removal plan. But they did install additional monitoring equipment to track what the unauthorized devices were doing. Over the next week, the pattern became clear. The biometric devices were collecting data from night shift workers, learning their biological rhythms, and using that information to optimize machinery performance. But the optimization went beyond simple efficiency improvements. The equipment was learning to anticipate worker behavior, adjusting operations based on predicted human responses. If someone was getting tired, the line would slow slightly to reduce stress. If a worker was alert and focused, machinery would run at peak efficiency. The entire plant was becoming responsive to human biological states. Management called it revolutionary workplace integration, some kind of experimental program to improve worker-machine interface. But they couldn't explain who had authorized the installation, or why there were no records of the project in company files. The smell of ozone got stronger near the biometric devices as the weeks passed, sharp and electric, like the air around high-voltage equipment. But the devices were low-power systems that shouldn't generate that kind of smell. I put in for a transfer to day shift a month later, told them I wanted more regular hours, which was partly true, but mainly I didn't want to work in a factory where the machines were learning to read my vital signs. The night shift replacement lasted 6 weeks before requesting a different assignment. Said the equipment made him uncomfortable, too responsive to his presence. Factory management eventually embraced the modifications, called it a pilot program for biological integration technology, claimed it improved efficiency and reduced workplace injuries. But the workers who stayed on night shift reported that the machinery's responsiveness was getting more sophisticated. Equipment would start running before workers arrived at their stations. Robots would adjust their movements based on predicted human behavior. Like the entire factory was developing a form of artificial intuition based on continuous monitoring of human biological data. I never found out who installed the original devices, but I learned to pay attention to unauthorized modifications in industrial environments. Some improvements come with costs that aren't immediately obvious. Quick pause. If these stories are doing a good job at keeping you company tonight, subscribe to not only know about my newest uploads, but to support this channel as well. Thank you, and let's get back to the stories. Every morning, the kitchen timer had counted down exactly how long I'd been asleep. I'd rented the ranch house in October, a single-story place about 20 miles northwest of Austin in the Texas Hill Country. Previous tenant had been a family with kids, but they'd moved to Dallas and left the place furnished. Good deal for someone who wanted space and quiet while working on a novel. The kitchen was dated but functional. Avocado green appliances from the 1980s, including a microwave with a digital timer that the landlord mentioned sometimes acts up. I figured he meant it occasionally reset itself or displayed incorrect time. First few weeks, everything was normal. I'd use the microwave for coffee and leftovers, ignore the timer function since I had my phone for cooking. Old appliances have quirks, and as long as the basic functions worked, I wasn't concerned about cosmetic issues. Third week, I started noticing the timer display. Every morning when I came into the kitchen for coffee, the microwave timer would be counting down from some number, usually around 7 hours, sometimes 6 or 8. depending on how well I'd slept. At first, I assumed it was malfunctioning, displaying random countdown numbers. But the numbers were too specific, too consistent. Wednesday morning. Timer showed 7:23:15 and counting down. I tried to remember what time I'd gone to sleep. Around 11:30 p.m., woken up around 6:45 a.m. Quick calculation put my sleep time at approximately 7 hours and 15 minutes. Close enough to be coincidental, but specific enough to be strange. Thursday night, I paid closer attention to my sleep schedule. In bed by 11:15 p.m., alarm set for 6:30 a.m. Total planned sleep, 7 hours, 15 minutes. Friday morning, timer displayed 7:12:47 and counting down. I'd actually fallen asleep around 11:18 p.m. and woken up at 6:31 a.m. The timer was showing almost exactly how long I'd been unconscious, accurate to within a few minutes. The microwave was somehow tracking my sleep. I tested it systematically. Saturday night, I went to bed at 10:45 p.m. Set my alarm for 7 a.m. Planned sleep duration, 8 hours, 15 minutes. Sunday morning, timer showed 8:09:33 and counting down. I'd fallen asleep around 10:51 p.m. and woken up at 7:01 a.m. The timer was tracking my actual sleep time, not just the hours I spent in bed. But here's what really bothered me. The timer was counting down, not up, like it was showing time remaining rather than time elapsed. But time remaining until what? I started documenting the pattern. Each morning I'd note the timer display, then calculate my actual sleep duration based on when I remembered falling asleep and waking up. The correlation was perfect. The timer consistently showed my precise sleep duration, accurate to within minutes. But it wasn't just the microwave. The coffee maker had a timer function that I'd never used. But I noticed it was displaying numbers too, always showing the time I'd gone to bed the night before. If I'd fallen asleep at 11:23 p.m., the coffee maker timer would show 11:23. The oven's digital clock was displaying when I'd woken up, not the current time, but the specific minute I'd regained consciousness each morning. All the kitchen appliances were somehow monitoring my sleep cycle. November, I decided to test their accuracy. I kept a detailed sleep journal, noting exact times I turned off lights, when I felt myself falling asleep, any times I woke during the night, and when I finally got out of bed. The appliances were uncannily precise. If I had been awake from 2:15 to 2:31 a.m., the microwave timer would be 16 minutes shorter than expected the next morning. If I dozed an extra 12 minutes after my alarm, the oven clock would show that later wake-up time instead of when the alarm had sounded. They weren't just tracking when I was in bed. They were monitoring my actual consciousness state. Around Thanksgiving, I found the modifications. While cleaning behind the refrigerator, I discovered a small electronic device plugged into a hidden outlet. Sophisticated equipment with multiple sensors and what looked like a wireless transmitter. Similar devices were hidden behind other appliances throughout the kitchen, all recently installed, all actively monitoring something. But what disturbed me most was how they were connected. Thin wires running from each device to the appliance's power supplies, integrated into the existing electrical systems. Someone had spent considerable time modifying the kitchen electronics to create a comprehensive sleep monitoring network. I took photos, then started checking other rooms. Found more devices in the bedroom, bathroom, even the living room, all connected by a network of concealed wiring that suggested professional installation. The house had been turned into a sleep research laboratory. I called the landlord, asked about recent electrical work. Previous tenants mentioned some issues with the appliances, he said. Had an electrician out a few months ago to fix the problems. Nice guy, very thorough. Spent a whole weekend rewiring the kitchen. Do you have his contact information? I'll dig up the invoice and get back to you. He never called back. That night, I decided to test the system's limits. Instead of my normal bedtime routine, I stayed awake all night, working on my novel and drinking coffee. By morning, the kitchen appliances were displaying error messages. The microwave timer showed 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, and was flashing. The coffee maker displayed error, where it normally showed bedtime. The oven clock was blinking random numbers. The system was designed to track normal sleep patterns, and my all-nighter had confused the monitoring algorithms. But around 8 a.m., exhausted from staying awake, I decided to take a short nap on the living room couch. When I woke up 2 hours later, the kitchen appliances had updated. The microwave timer showed 1 hour 47 minutes and 23 seconds and counting down. The coffee maker displayed 8:15, exactly when I'd fallen asleep on the couch. The system had detected my nap and adjusted its calculations accordingly. That's when I realized the monitoring wasn't just for data collection. The countdown timer wasn't showing elapsed sleep time. It was showing time remaining until something was scheduled to happen. But what was supposed to happen when the timer reached 0? I packed that afternoon. Didn't bother giving notice or explaining to the landlord. Just loaded my essentials into the car and drove back to Austin. As I was loading the last box, I noticed my kitchen chair had been moved. Instead of facing the table, it was positioned to face the window that overlooked the driveway. Like someone had been sitting there, watching me pack, timing my departure with the same precision they'd used to monitor my sleep. The white gas camping stove I kept for emergencies had been moved too, positioned on the counter near where the monitoring equipment was hidden. The blue flame flare, when I tested it, cast strange shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to move independently of the flame. I drove away without looking back, but I kept checking my rearview mirror for the first hour. No other cars on the rural road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was tracking my departure with the same methodical attention it had paid to my sleep schedule. Found a new place in the city, third-floor apartment with standard electrical systems and appliances that only displayed the time and temperature. But sometimes I catch myself checking digital clocks in the morning, wondering if they know more about my sleep than they should. Old habits from a house where every appliance was watching, learning, and counting down to something I never wanted to discover. I followed my own footprints to a place I'd never been. Glacier Point sits at the edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, about 15 miles northeast of Kalispell. February isn't peak season for backcountry camping, but I'd wanted to photograph the area after a fresh snowfall, and winter camping has its own rewards if you're prepared for the conditions. I'd driven up Saturday morning, parked at the winter trailhead, and hiked in about 6 miles to a protected camping spot I'd used before. The snow was perfect, about 18 inches of fresh powder over a solid base, cold enough to be stable, but not so deep that travel became impossible. Set up camp took longer in winter conditions, but I had the routine down. 4-season tent, winter sleeping bag rated to -20, white gas stove that would function in cold weather. By the time everything was secured, the sun was already dropping behind the western ridges. Sunday morning, I woke to find it had snowed another 4 inches during the night. Perfect conditions for tracking. The fresh snow would show every detail of animal movement, and the cold temperatures meant the surface would hold clear impressions. I made coffee on the stove, planned my day hike to the Glacier overlook. Beautiful morning, clear skies, temperature around 15 degrees. Cold but manageable with proper gear. That's when I noticed the footprints. Leading away from my tent, heading northeast toward the overlook, was a clear set of boot prints in the fresh snow. Size 10.5 Merrell hiking boots, same pattern as mine, same stride length and gait characteristics. But I hadn't left camp yet. I checked my boots, compared the tread pattern to the prints in the snow. Perfect match, down to the specific wear patterns on the heel and the distinctive nick in the left sole from a sharp rock I'd stepped on last summer. Someone had been walking around my campsite wearing identical boots to mine. I followed the tracks. They led northeast from my tent, following what looked like a planned route toward the Glacier viewpoint. Steady pace, confident navigation, no hesitation or course corrections. But here's what bothered me. The tracks showed perfect knowledge of the terrain. In winter conditions, with 18 inches of snow cover, most of the familiar landmarks were hidden. Navigation required either extensive local knowledge or GPS assistance. Yet these tracks went straight to destinations I'd been planning to visit. The footprints led to the overlook I'd intended to hike to that morning. Then they continued beyond, following routes I'd considered, but decided against due to avalanche risk and weather conditions. According to the tracks, I'd spent several hours exploring areas I'd specifically avoided for safety reasons. I followed the trail as far as I dared, taking photos of the clearest print impressions. The tracks showed someone who knew the area intimately, who understood winter travel techniques, and who had no concerns about the hazards that made me cautious. But they were definitely my boots making those tracks. Around noon, I found something that changed everything. At a rest stop about 2 miles from camp, the tracks showed someone sitting on a fallen log, eating lunch. Clear impression of boots propped up, snow disturbed where someone had unpacked food. But in the snow next to the log, I found wrapper from an energy bar, specific brand and flavor that I carried in my day pack. I checked my pack. The energy bar was gone, even though I distinctly remembered putting it there during my morning prep. Someone wearing my boots had taken food from my pack and eaten it at a location I'd never visited. I followed the tracks back toward camp, paying closer attention to the timeline. Based on snow depth and track definition, the prints had been made early in the morning, probably around 6 a.m., but I'd been asleep until 7:30 a.m., and I distinctly remembered the energy bar being in my pack when I'd prepared it at 8 a.m. The tracks suggested I'd been hiking while I was asleep and taking gear that was still in my possession when I woke up. That afternoon, I decided to test something. I started hiking toward the Glacier overlook, following the same route the mystery tracks had taken. But instead of staying on the established trail, the morning tracks had followed a more direct route that cut across potential avalanche zones, terrain that required specific knowledge of safe winter travel corridors. I stuck to the safer established trail, but I could see where my boots had gone. The morning tracks showed confidence and local knowledge that I didn't possess. Around 4 p.m. I found the source of the problem. At the Glacier overlook, partially hidden by wind-blown snow, was a small camp. Single tent, minimal gear, but clearly someone had been staying there for several days. The tent was the same model as mine. The gear scattered around the camp was identical to what I carried. Even the food wrappers matched the brands in my pack. But most disturbing was the pair of boots sitting outside the tent. Merrell hiking boots, size 10.5, with the same wear patterns and sole damage as mine. including the distinctive nick in the left sole. I was looking at an exact duplicate of my own camping gear, including boots that showed identical wear patterns to equipment I'd owned for 2 years. That's when I heard my own voice calling from inside the tent. Beautiful day for winter camping. Snow conditions are perfect. Good visibility for photography. Comments I'd made that morning while preparing for the day hike, now being spoken by someone in a tent I'd never seen before. The voice timing was slightly off, like someone repeating phrases they'd memorized but didn't fully understand. Each comment delivered a second or two after it would naturally occur in conversation. I backed away from the camp, started hiking quickly back toward my own tent, but I could hear footsteps behind me, matching my pace exactly. Same rhythm, same stride length, like someone had studied my walking patterns and learned to replicate them perfectly. When I looked back, I could see another figure following about 50 yards behind. Same height, same build, wearing identical gear to mine, but the distance and snow conditions made it impossible to see facial details. I reached my camp around sunset, packed everything with unusual speed. Winter camping requires methodical preparation, but I was willing to cut corners to get out of the area before full darkness. As I broke camp, I could see lights moving near the Glacier overlook. Headlamp beams following the same patterns I'd used while packing, like someone was copying my exact camping routine. I hiked out by headlamp, using GPS navigation to stay on the correct trail. The route back to the trailhead was familiar enough that I could manage it safely in darkness. But throughout the night hike, I could hear other footsteps in the snow behind me, always the same distance back, always matching my pace and rest stops. When I'd pause to check my GPS, the footsteps would stop too. When I'd resume hiking, they'd start again, with the same rhythm I was using. By the time I reached my truck at dawn, the footsteps had stopped. I threw my pack in the back, drove straight home without stopping for breakfast or rest. But I kept thinking about those duplicate boots and the voice that knew exactly what I'd said earlier in the day. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the Forest Service. Another winter camper had reported strange tracks in the Glacier Point area, boot prints that led to places the camper had never been, using gear that was still in their possession. They'd organized a search, thinking someone might be lost in the winter conditions. Found an abandoned campsite with duplicate gear, but no sign of whoever had been using it. The ranger mentioned one detail that stayed with me. They'd found voice recordings hidden near the abandoned camp. Professional equipment, designed to capture and replay human speech. When they played the recordings back, all they heard were conversations in my voice, comments about weather conditions, navigation decisions, and camping techniques. Like something had been studying my winter camping methods, learning to replicate not just my gear and movements, but my decision-making processes. I never went back to Glacier Point in winter, but I learned to pay attention to my own tracks, making sure they only go where I remember walking. Some footprints are better left unfollowed. The power turbine was humming songs my grandmother used to sing to me. Bankhead Power Station operates a coal-fired electrical generation facility about 30 miles northwest of Birmingham, providing power to 6 counties across central Alabama. I worked night operations there, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Wednesday through Sunday. Good technical job that required monitoring complex systems while maintaining steady electrical output to the regional grid. The main turbine hall housed 3 massive steam turbines, each one generating about 300 megawatts when operating at full capacity. During normal operation, The turbines produced a steady harmonic hum, deep, resonant tones that came from precision-balanced machinery, spinning at 3,600 RPM. You learn to read the turbines by sound. Slight variations in pitch or rhythm can indicate bearing problems, steam pressure issues, or electrical load changes. After 3 years of night shifts, I could diagnose most turbine problems just by listening to the harmonic patterns. December 8th, I was doing routine turbine monitoring when I first heard something different in the mechanical harmonics. Unit 2 was operating normally, carrying about 280 megawatts of load. The usual steady hum, deep and constant. But within that mechanical drone, I could hear what sounded like a melody. Faint but distinct, like someone humming a tune within the turbine noise. At first, I assumed it was acoustic interference. Sometimes radio signals can create harmonic patterns in large electrical equipment, but the melody was too clear, too structured to be random electromagnetic noise. The tune was Mockingbird Hill, an old country song my grandmother used to sing when I was young. Specific melody, correct rhythm, embedded somehow in the turbine's mechanical harmonics. I checked the control panel readings. Unit 2 was operating within normal parameters. Steam pressure, electrical output, bearing temperatures all standard. But the harmonic signature definitely included musical elements that shouldn't have been there. Around midnight, I realized it wasn't just one song. The turbine harmonics shifted to Amazing Grace, then Old Rugged Cross, then Sweet By and By. All hymns my grandmother had sung during my childhood, delivered in the same humming style she'd used when I was small. But these weren't random religious songs. They were specific versions, with the same variations and personal touches my grandmother had added. Musical memories from 30 years ago, now somehow integrated into industrial turbine noise. I called the control room, asked if anyone else was hearing unusual sounds from Unit 2. Negative, came the reply. All turbine harmonics show normal on the monitoring equipment. You hearing something unusual down there? Maybe just acoustic effects. I'll keep monitoring. But over the next hour, the musical elements became more pronounced. The turbine wasn't just producing random melodies. It was playing a concert of my grandmother's favorite songs, delivered in her distinctive humming style. Around 2 a.m., I decided to investigate the turbine more closely. Unit 2's turbine hall was about the size of a gymnasium, with the massive steam turbine mounted on a concrete foundation that extended 30 feet below floor level. Catwalks and maintenance platforms provided access to various monitoring points around the machinery. While checking the bearing temperature sensors, I found something that wasn't supposed to be there. A small electronic device mounted inside the turbine housing, connected to the vibration monitoring system. Sophisticated piece of equipment with audio processing capability and what looked like a memory storage unit. The device was analyzing the turbine's harmonic output and somehow modifying it to create musical patterns. I took photos, documented the location, then continued my inspection. Found similar devices at 2 other monitoring points, all recently installed and actively processing acoustic data. But what disturbed me was how the devices had obtained the specific musical information. The songs weren't just generic melodies. They were personal memories, delivered in my grandmother's exact singing style. Someone had been collecting detailed audio information about my family history. I called my supervisor, reported the unauthorized modifications. "I'll send someone down to look," he said. "But we haven't authorized any new monitoring equipment on the turbines. Those devices shouldn't be there." While I waited for backup, I continued monitoring the other units. Unit 1 was producing different musical patterns. children's songs I remembered from elementary school. Unit 3 was playing instrumental versions of songs I'd heard at my high school graduation. All 3 turbines were somehow accessing different periods of my personal musical memory. Around 4 a.m., my supervisor arrived with a team from the electrical maintenance department. They examined the devices I'd found, ran diagnostics on the turbine control systems. "This is sophisticated audio processing equipment," the electrical supervisor said. "Whoever installed it has detailed knowledge of turbine harmonics and digital signal processing. How are they creating the musical patterns? The devices are analyzing the natural turbine harmonics and using frequency modulation to embed musical information, like turning the entire turbine into a massive musical instrument." But where are they getting the specific songs? Good question. The devices have wireless capability. They could be receiving audio data from external sources. The team decided to trace the wireless signals, using spectrum analyzers to identify where the musical information was coming from. What they found was disturbing. The devices were connected to a local wireless network that included monitoring equipment throughout the power plant, but the network extended beyond the facility, connecting to receivers positioned around the surrounding rural area. Someone had installed a comprehensive audio surveillance system, with the power plant turbines as the output devices for a much larger monitoring operation. "They're not just playing music," the supervisor explained. "They're demonstrating how much personal information they've collected. The songs are proof of concept, showing that they can access detailed memories and reproduce them through industrial equipment. What's the purpose? Unknown. But this level of surveillance and audio processing suggests someone is studying human psychological responses to familiar audio stimuli in industrial environments." The smell of hot plastic got stronger near the audio processing devices as the investigation continued. Sharp and acrid, like electrical components overheating. But the devices were designed for industrial environments and should have operated within normal temperature ranges. They removed the devices immediately, but the turbine harmonics continued producing musical patterns for several more hours. Like the acoustic modifications had created permanent changes in the turbine's resonant characteristics. I put in for a transfer to day shift the following week. Told management I wanted more regular hours, which was partly true, but mainly I didn't want to work alone with machinery that could access and reproduce my childhood memories. The night shift replacement lasted 1 month before requesting a different assignment. Said the turbines made him uncomfortable, producing sounds that reminded him of personal experiences he'd never discussed with anyone. Plant management eventually hired acoustic consultants to analyze the turbine harmonics and eliminate any unusual musical patterns. They installed sound dampening materials and modified the steam flow systems to reduce harmonic complexity. But according to current night shift operators, the turbines still occasionally produce melodies that seem personally familiar to whoever is listening. Like the acoustic modifications created a permanent connection between the machinery and human memory, accessible under the right conditions. I never found out who installed the original monitoring equipment, but I learned to pay attention to the sounds that industrial machinery makes, especially when those sounds seem to know more about my personal history than they should. Some harmonics are better left unheard. The smoke detector was beeping in Morse code, spelling out my social security number. I'd rented the coastal cabin for a month-long writing retreat, a small place about 5 miles south of Cannon Beach, with no neighbors and limited cell service. Perfect for someone trying to finish a novel without distractions. The cabin was basic, but functional. Wood stove for heat, propane for cooking, solar panels for minimal electrical needs. The smoke detector was one of those battery-powered units that occasionally chirp when the battery gets low. Standard safety equipment that I barely noticed during the first week, but around day 10, the chirping pattern changed. Instead of random single beeps, the detector was producing sequences of short and long tones, rhythmic patterns that sounded almost like communication signals. At first, I assumed the battery was failing in an unusual way, creating irregular voltage that affected the chirp timing. But the patterns were too consistent, too structured to be random electrical malfunction. Tuesday evening, I was working on Chapter 12 when the detector started a long sequence. Beep, 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 pause, beep, pause, beep, beep, pause, beep, 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 pause. I know Morse code from my time in the Army Reserve. The sequence spelled out SOS. That got my attention. I listened more carefully as the pattern continued. The detector was definitely transmitting in Morse code, but not random distress signals. It was sending organized information, like someone was using it to transmit data. Over the next hour, I decoded the transmissions, my full name, my birth date, my current address. Then, most disturbing of all, my social security number. The smoke detector was broadcasting my personal information in Morse code. I climbed up to examine the unit more closely. Standard residential smoke detector, same model you'd find in any hardware store. But when I opened the battery compartment, I found the modifications. Additional circuitry had been installed, connected to the existing alarm system, but clearly not original equipment. Small circuit board with wireless capability, drawing power from the main battery. Someone had turned the smoke detector into a data transmission device. I documented the modifications with photos, then checked the other safety equipment in the cabin. The carbon monoxide detector had similar modifications. Even the propane gas detector showed signs of recent electronic work. All the safety devices had been converted into communication equipment. But what bothered me most was the accuracy of the transmitted information. The data being sent wasn't just publicly available information. It included details from my credit report, employment history, even medical records that should have been confidential. Someone had comprehensive access to my personal files. I called the cabin rental company, reported the unauthorized equipment modifications. "We'll send someone out to look," the manager said, "but we don't install any special equipment in the cabins. Just standard safety devices required by insurance. These have been modified. Someone's added wireless transmitters. I'll make some calls, see if the previous maintenance work included any upgrades." But when I asked about the most recent maintenance, the story got confusing. According to the rental company, no work had been done on the cabin in 6 months. But the electronic modifications were clearly recent. Fresh solder joints, new component mounting, even updated firmware on the wireless modules. Someone had been in the cabin recently, doing sophisticated electronic work without the owner's knowledge. Wednesday night, the transmissions evolved. Instead of just sending static information about my identity, the smoke detector started broadcasting real-time data. My current location, accurate to GPS coordinates. My daily routine, times I woke up, ate meals, went to sleep. Even my work schedule, how long I spent writing, when I took breaks. The safety devices were monitoring my activities and transmitting detailed behavioral data. But the most disturbing development was that other devices started joining the network. The propane detector began transmitting in a different code, seemed to be sending information about my phone calls and internet usage. The carbon monoxide detector was broadcasting data that looked like financial transaction records. All three devices were participating in comprehensive surveillance, each one handling different categories of personal information. Thursday, I tried to disable the devices by removing the modified circuit boards. But when I disconnected the first wireless module, all the detectors started broadcasting emergency signals simultaneously, not just to each other. The signals were being transmitted to external receivers somewhere in the area. Within 20 minutes, I heard vehicles approaching on the access road. 2 SUVs with tinted windows moving slowly like they were looking for something. I watched from the window as they drove past the cabin twice, then parked at a turnout about half a mile away. The occupants didn't get out, but they positioned themselves with clear sight lines to the cabin. Someone was responding to the emergency signals from the modified safety equipment. I packed essential items, preparing to leave quickly if necessary. But before I could finish, the smoke detector started a new transmission pattern. This time, it wasn't Morse code. The beeping pattern was more complex, almost like the DTMF tones used by old touch-tone phones. But the sequence was too long and too precise to be random button presses. I recognized the pattern. It was reproducing the exact sequence of numbers I'd entered when calling my bank that morning to check account balances. The device wasn't just monitoring my calls, it was recording and retransmitting the specific button presses I'd made on my phone. Complete financial access, broadcast to anyone with the right decoding equipment. The smell of mouse nest ammonia started getting stronger around the modified detectors. Sharp and acrid, like small animals had been nesting in electrical equipment. But I'd been in the cabin for 2 weeks without seeing any signs of rodent activity. That's when I noticed the Starfield gap. Looking out the window toward where the SUVs were parked, I could see a section of night sky where several bright stars seemed to be missing. Not blocked by clouds, just absent, like something was interfering with the light. The gap moved slowly across the sky, suggesting it wasn't a natural atmospheric phenomenon. I left that night, driving with headlights off until I reached the Maine coastal highway. The SUVs followed for about 10 miles, then turned off at a Forest Service road that wasn't marked on any maps. When I checked my phone later, I found that several financial accounts had been accessed during the time I was driving. Small transactions, just a few dollars each, but enough to confirm that someone was testing their access to my banking information. The modified smoke detectors had provided complete financial surveillance, including the ability to conduct transactions using data they'd collected. I never went back to get the rest of my belongings. Told the rental company I'd had a family emergency and needed to leave early. But I kept copies of the photos showing the device modifications, and sometimes I review them when I'm trying to understand what happened in that coastal cabin. The most disturbing part isn't that someone converted safety equipment into surveillance devices. It's that they had real-time access to information that should have been secure, and they were using that access to demonstrate how completely they could monitor and manipulate my personal affairs. Like the smoke detector transmissions were a warning, showing me how much they knew and what they could do with that knowledge. The Coyote pack was howling in perfect harmony with my phone's ringtone. I'd driven out to the Organ Mountains for a 3-day solo camping trip, planning to summit Rabbit Ears Peak and do some astrophotography in the clear desert air. March weather was perfect for high desert camping. Warm days, cool nights, and minimal chance of storms. The access road ended at about 6,500 feet elevation, leaving a 2-mile hike to reach good camping spots near treeline. I found a protected site on the northeast face of the peak, sheltered from prevailing winds and with clear views toward the Tularosa Basin. Setup went smooth. Single wall tent, minimalist gear, everything I needed for 3 days of desert solitude. By sunset, I had camp squared away and dinner cooking on the white gas stove. The coyotes started calling around 9 p.m., which was normal for the area. Small pack, maybe 4 or 5 animals, communicating across the ridgelines with the usual yips and howls. Beautiful wild sounds that added to the desert camping experience. But around 10 p.m., something changed in their vocalizations. My phone rang, unusual since I barely had 1 bar of signal. And while I was checking the display, the coyote pack started howling in harmony with the ringtone. Not just random howls that happened to occur during the phone call. The coyotes were matching the exact pitch and rhythm of my ringtone, creating a multi-part harmony that complemented the electronic melody. The call was a wrong number, ended after about 10 seconds, but the coyotes continued their harmonic version of the ringtone for another 30 seconds, like they were finishing the song. I'd never heard anything like it. Coyotes are intelligent, adaptable animals, but they don't typically mimic electronic sounds with that level of precision. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again, another wrong number. And again, the coyote pack joined in with perfect harmonic accompaniment to the ringtone. This time I listened more carefully. The coyotes weren't just matching the basic melody, they were creating complex harmonies, with different pack members taking different vocal parts, like a wilderness choir performing electronic music. Around 11 p.m. I decided to test their responsiveness. I triggered my phone's ringtone manually, holding down the volume button to make it ring without an actual call. The coyote pack responded immediately, launching into their harmonic version with precision timing. I tried it several more times over the next hour. Each time, perfect response. The coyotes had somehow learned my specific ringtone and developed a coordinated musical response. But here's what really bothered me. My ringtone wasn't a standard melody. It was a custom sound file I'd created using audio editing software. A complex electronic composition that shouldn't have been easy for wild animals to learn and reproduce. Yet the coyotes were performing it with better harmonic sophistication than most human singers could manage. Around midnight, I tried a different experiment. Instead of the ringtone, I played other sounds from my phone. Text message alerts, alarm sounds, even some music files. The coyotes responded to all of them, creating instant harmonic arrangements for whatever audio I played. Simple sounds got simple responses. Complex melodies got elaborate multi-part harmonies. It was like having a professional choir of wild animals providing live accompaniment to electronic devices. But the most disturbing part was how quickly they learned new sounds. A single playing of an unfamiliar tone was enough for them to memorize and harmonize with it. This wasn't normal animal behavior. This was trained performance. Wednesday morning, I hiked around the peak, looking for signs of unusual human activity in the area. Found several things that shouldn't have been there. Small electronic devices hidden in rock crevices, solar-powered and equipped with speakers. The devices were playing various electronic sounds at low volume. Phone alerts, alarm clocks, even fragments of popular music. Someone had been training the local coyote population to respond to electronic audio cues. I documented the devices with photos, noting their positions and technical specifications. Professional equipment designed for long-term outdoor operation. This wasn't amateur wildlife research. It was sophisticated animal conditioning. But why would someone want to train coyotes to harmonize with electronic devices? That evening I got my answer. Around 8 p.m., before the coyotes started their usual calling, I heard different sounds from the ridge above camp. Electronic tones broadcast at higher volume than the training devices I'd found. The coyotes responded immediately, but not with harmonies. This time, they were producing perfect reproductions of human speech. Beautiful evening for camping. Clear skies tonight. Perfect weather conditions. All delivered in coyote vocalizations, but structured like human language. The pack was somehow reproducing the speech patterns they'd heard from campers and hikers, integrated into their natural communication system. I realized I was listening to a comprehensive audio surveillance network, using trained wild animals as both recording and playback devices. The coyotes weren't just learning electronic sounds for entertainment. They were being conditioned to capture and reproduce human speech, creating a natural surveillance system that could monitor wilderness areas without detection. Wednesday night, the system revealed its full capabilities. Instead of random speech fragments, the coyotes started reproducing specific conversations. Phone calls I'd made earlier in the day, comments I'd said to myself while setting up camp, even thoughts I'd spoken aloud without realizing it. The pack was playing back detailed recordings of my activities, delivered through natural coyote vocalizations that would seem normal to anyone not listening carefully. Perfect camouflage surveillance, using wild animals as the delivery system. Around 10 p.m. I heard my own voice calling from the ridge above camp, reproduced through coyote howls but unmistakably my speech patterns. Help, I'm lost. Can't find the trail back to camp. Please, someone help me. Distress calls I'd never made, but delivered in my voice through the trained coyote pack, like someone was creating false emergency scenarios using my recorded speech. The moon broke through some clouds, casting silver light across the desert landscape. In that light, I could see shapes moving on the ridges around my camp, not coyotes, but human figures positioning electronic equipment and monitoring the animal responses. The training devices weren't just conditioning tools. They were part of an active surveillance operation, with human operators directing the coyotes' audio reproduction in real time. I packed by moonlight and started hiking out immediately. Whatever was happening in those mountains, I didn't want to be the subject of further surveillance experiments. As I hiked toward the trailhead, I could hear the coyote pack following along the ridgeline, providing a running commentary on my evacuation in my own voice. Moving quickly now. Seems concerned about something. Heading back to the vehicle, like nature documentary narration, delivered through wild animal calls that masked the artificial surveillance network operating in the wilderness. I reached my truck around 2 a.m., drove straight home without stopping. But I couldn't stop thinking about those trained coyotes and the sophisticated conditioning programs someone had implemented. A week later, I called the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, reported the electronic devices and unusual animal behavior. They sent a team to investigate, found some of the training equipment, but no evidence of ongoing human activity. The coyotes had returned to normal vocalizations. No more electronic harmonies or speech reproduction. But the ranger I spoke with mentioned something interesting. They'd received similar reports from other wilderness areas across the Southwest. Wild animals producing sounds that seemed too sophisticated for natural behavior. Always in remote areas, always involving species known for intelligence and adaptability, and always with evidence of recent human presence that couldn't be traced to legitimate research activities. Like someone was running experiments on wildlife communication systems, using wild animals as components in surveillance networks that could monitor wilderness areas without detection. I never went back to the Organ Mountains. but I learned to listen carefully to wild animal calls, especially when they sound more sophisticated than they should. Some harmonies are better left unheard. The grain falling from the conveyor was spelling out letters on the warehouse floor. Heartland Grain Processing operates a regional facility outside Indianapolis, handling corn, soybeans, and wheat from farms across central Indiana. I worked night shift there for 2 years, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Monday through Friday. Quality control and equipment monitoring, making sure the grain handling systems ran smoothly during overnight processing. The main conveyor system could process about 500 bushels per hour, moving grain from storage silos through cleaning and sorting equipment before loading it into rail cars for shipment. Normally, the grain fell in predictable patterns, steady streams that created uniform piles on the warehouse floor. March 12th, I was monitoring the corn processing line when I noticed something unusual in the grain distribution pattern. Instead of the normal even flow, the conveyor was creating gaps and clusters in the falling grain. Not random variation, the patterns looked deliberate, like someone was controlling the flow rate to create specific shapes. At first, I thought it was mechanical problems, blockages in the conveyor chutes, worn distribution plates, maybe foreign material causing irregular flow. But when I looked more closely, the grain patterns looked like letters. The letter H formed in yellow corn kernels on the concrete floor. I watched for another few minutes. The conveyor continued creating patterns. E, then L, then P. The grain handling system was spelling out H-E-L-P on the warehouse floor. I checked the control panel settings. Everything showed normal operation, conveyor speed, flow rate, distribution settings, all within standard parameters. But the grain continued falling in letter patterns. Over the next hour, the messages became more complex. Night shift appeared in soybeans near the rail car loading area. Someone watching formed in wheat kernels by the storage silos. Not alone here, spelled out in mixed grain near the main entrance. The conveyor system was somehow being controlled to create written communication using falling agricultural products. I called the facility manager at home, reported the equipment malfunction. "Conveyors don't spell words," he said. "You sure you're seeing patterns and not just random grain distribution?" "I'm looking at H-E-L-P spelled out in corn right now. This isn't random. I'll come in early, take a look. But check all the mechanical systems first. Might be blockages causing unusual flow patterns." I spent the next 2 hours inspecting every part of the grain handling system. Conveyors, chutes, distribution plates, even the storage silo discharge mechanisms. Everything appeared to be functioning normally, but the messages continued appearing on the warehouse floor. Maintenance needed in corn. System modified in soybeans. Check control room in wheat. The last message got my attention. I'd been focused on the mechanical equipment, but maybe the problem was in the computerized control systems. The control room housed the programmable logic controllers that managed grain flow rates, conveyor speeds, and distribution patterns. Sophisticated automation that could theoretically be programmed to create specific grain distribution patterns. But who would program agricultural equipment to spell out messages? I examined the control system more carefully, checking recent programming changes and access logs. Found several unauthorized modifications to the grain flow algorithms, all made during night shifts over the past month. Someone with administrative access had been reprogramming the facility's automation systems. The modifications were subtle, small changes to flow timing and distribution patterns that wouldn't affect normal operations, but could create controlled grain patterns when activated. Around 4 a.m. I found the activation mechanism. Hidden in the main control program was a communications subroutine that monitored facility personnel and created grain messages based on predetermined triggers. When certain conditions were met, specific staff assignments, time periods, or security states, the system would start spelling out messages. But the messages weren't random. They contained detailed information about facility operations, staff schedules, even personal information about employees. Someone was using the grain handling system to demonstrate comprehensive surveillance of the processing facility. I documented the unauthorized programming, took screenshots of the modified control algorithms, but as I was saving the evidence, the grain messages changed tone. "Stop investigating" appeared in mixed grain near my workstation. "Return to normal duties" formed in corn by the loading dock. "Forget what you have seen" spelled out in soybeans near the main entrance. The surveillance system was responding to my investigation in real time, creating messages that specifically address my actions. Around 5 a.m., I discovered how extensive the modifications were. The unauthorized programming wasn't just controlling grain distribution. It had integrated with the facility's security systems, personnel tracking, even the employee database. The system knew where I was at any given time, what tasks I was performing, even which computer terminals I was using. And it was using that information to create targeted messages delivered through agricultural equipment. Perfect camouflage surveillance. Who would suspect grain handling equipment of being used for communication? I called the facility manager again, told him about the programming modifications. "I'm coming in immediately," he said. "Don't touch anything else in the control room until I get there." But while I waited, the messages escalated. Instead of single words or simple phrases, the grain system started creating complex sentences with detailed personal information. My home address spelled out in corn. My vehicle license plate formed in soybeans. Even my social security number displayed in wheat kernels. The surveillance system had access to comprehensive personal data and was using grain distribution to prove its capabilities. When the facility manager arrived at 6 a.m., he found me documenting the messages with photos and video recordings. "This is impossible," he said, looking at my home address spelled out in grain on the warehouse floor. "Agricultural equipment can't access personal databases. The control systems have been modified. Someone's integrated surveillance capabilities into the grain handling automation." We traced the unauthorized network connections, found that the facility's automation systems had been linked to external databases and monitoring equipment. The grain processing facility had become a node in a larger surveillance network. The reflective tags we used to mark maintenance points had been repositioned to correspond with security camera angles and data collection points. Like someone had been optimizing the facility layout for surveillance purposes. Management decided to completely reprogram the control systems, removing all unauthorized modifications. But the process took 3 weeks, during which time the grain messages continued. I put in for a transfer to day shift, citing concerns about working alone with compromised automation systems. The night shift replacement lasted 1 month before requesting a different assignment. Said the grain handling equipment made him uncomfortable, creating patterns that seemed too deliberate for mechanical systems. Facility management eventually hired additional security and implemented strict access controls for the automation systems. But according to current staff, the grain distribution patterns occasionally still show signs of deliberate control. Like the unauthorized modifications created permanent changes in the system's behavior that couldn't be completely eliminated through reprogramming. I learned to pay attention to patterns in industrial processes, especially when those patterns seem too organized to be accidental. Some messages are better left unread. The furnace was breathing with the exact rhythm Sarah used to have during sleep. I'd rented the farmhouse in November, looking for somewhere quiet to live, while the divorce proceedings worked their way through the legal system. A 19th century place about 15 miles outside Montpellier, with original hardwood floors and a basement oil furnace that the landlord said has character but works fine. Sarah and I had been separated for 6 months, but the legal process was dragging on. Shared custody arrangements, asset division, all the complicated details of untangling a 15-year marriage. The farmhouse rental was temporary, just until everything got settled and I could find something permanent. The heating system was typical for an old Vermont house. Oil-fired furnace in the basement. Hot air distributed through ductwork that had probably been installed in the 1950s. It worked adequately, though the furnace had a distinctive rhythm when it cycled on and off. December, I started noticing something familiar about that rhythm. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the furnace was running regularly, I could hear the breathing pattern through the heat registers. Steady inhalation and exhalation, like someone sleeping peacefully. But not just any breathing pattern. The specific rhythm Sarah used to have during deep sleep. Slightly irregular, with a small pause between breaths, and that soft whistling sound she made on the exhale. At first, I assumed it was psychological. Stress from the divorce, combined with living alone for the first time in years, making me hear familiar sounds in mechanical noise. The brain finds patterns everywhere, especially when you're emotionally vulnerable. But the resemblance was too precise to be coincidental. I'd lived with Sarah's breathing patterns for 15 years. I knew the exact timing of her sleep rhythm, the way it would change during different sleep stages, even how it sounded when she was getting sick or when she'd had too much wine with dinner. The furnace was reproducing all of those variations. Around Christmas, I started timing the furnace cycles, comparing them to my memories of Sarah's breathing. The correlation was perfect, about 16 breaths per minute during normal operation, slowing to 12 per minute during longer heating cycles, speeding up to 20 per minute when the system was working harder. Exactly the same respiratory rate Sarah had during different sleep states. I called a heating contractor, asked for an inspection of the oil furnace system. System's in good shape for its age, he reported. Burns clean. Good heat exchange efficiency. The cycling pattern is normal for this type of furnace. What about the breathing sounds? All furnaces make rhythmic sounds when they operate. Airflow, combustion cycling, heat expansion, and contraction. You'll get used to it. But I wasn't getting used to it. If anything, the resemblance to Sarah's breathing was becoming more pronounced. January, I realized it wasn't just breathing patterns. The heating system was reproducing other aspects of Sarah's nighttime behavior. The furnace would sigh occasionally, exactly the way she used to when shifting position during sleep. Sometimes it would make that small snoring sound she produced when her allergies were acting up. Even the timing was right. The furnace would cycle more frequently around 2 a.m., matching Sarah's tendency toward restless sleep during the early morning hours. The heating system somehow had detailed knowledge of my ex-wife's sleep behavior. I searched the house for monitoring equipment, thinking someone might have installed surveillance devices that were collecting personal information. Found several small electronic devices hidden in the basement near the furnace, sophisticated equipment with biometric sensors and wireless communication capability. But they weren't just monitoring current occupants. They had access to historical data about people who had previously lived in the house. Someone had been collecting detailed behavioral information about residents over an extended period. I documented the devices with photos, then tried to trace their network connections. The equipment was linked to a local wireless system that extended beyond the farmhouse property. But what disturbed me most was finding devices that had been monitoring Sarah specifically, even though she'd never lived in the farmhouse. The surveillance network had somehow obtained detailed information about her sleep patterns, breathing rhythm, even her specific behavioral quirks during different emotional states. February, the system expanded beyond just breathing patterns. The heating would adjust room temperatures to match Sarah's preferences: cooler bedroom, warmer kitchen, precisely the thermal environment she'd preferred in our married home. The furnace timing would match her daily schedule, running warmer in the morning when she liked to wake up slowly, cooling down in the evening when she preferred sleeping in a chill room. Even the air circulation patterns were modified to reproduce the specific airflow she'd enjoyed. Gentle movement from the bedroom register, stronger flow in the living room. The house was being environmentally conditioned to replicate Sarah's presence, but the psychological effect was devastating. Instead of helping me adjust to living alone, the house was constantly reminding me of her absence through environmental cues that triggered powerful emotional memories. I confronted the system by adjusting the thermostat to different settings, trying to override the programmed behavior patterns. But every change I made would be automatically reversed within hours. The house insisted on maintaining Sarah's preferred environmental conditions, regardless of my current needs or preferences. Around Valentine's Day, the manipulation became more aggressive. Instead of just reproducing Sarah's preferences, the heating system started creating environmental conditions associated with our most emotionally charged memories. The temperature and airflow would match specific days from our marriage, the settings we'd had during our first winter together, the thermal environment from our last anniversary, even the exact conditions from the night we'd had our final argument. Each environmental change would trigger detailed emotional memories, creating a psychological pressure that made it difficult to move forward with the divorce process. I realized someone was using the house's environmental controls to manipulate my emotional state, probably trying to influence the legal proceedings by keeping me psychologically connected to the marriage. The white gas camp stove I kept for emergencies became my refuge. When the heating system became too emotionally manipulative, I'd light the stove and focus on its steady blue flame and honest hiss. At least the camp stove wasn't trying to remind me of anyone. March, I found evidence that confirmed my suspicions. The monitoring equipment wasn't just collecting environmental data. It was recording detailed information about my emotional responses to different thermal conditions. Someone was studying how environmental manipulation could influence psychological states during emotionally vulnerable periods like divorce proceedings. The farmhouse was a laboratory for psychological pressure techniques, using heating system control to create targeted emotional responses. I moved out that week, found an apartment in Montpelier with modern electric heat and no personality. But I kept documentation of the environmental manipulation system, and sometimes I review it when I'm trying to understand what happened in that farmhouse. The most disturbing part isn't that someone used heating system control for psychological manipulation. It's that they had such detailed knowledge of my personal relationships that they could reproduce another person's presence through environmental cues alone. Like they'd been studying my marriage for years, learning exactly which memories and emotional triggers would be most effective for psychological pressure. New saguaro seedlings were sprouting in the exact pattern of my hiking route. I'd driven down to the Sonoran Desert for a 4-day camping trip, planning to photograph wildlife and explore some of the less traveled areas around Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. March weather was perfect for desert camping. Warm days, cool nights, and the wildflowers were just starting to bloom after winter rains. The backcountry camping area I'd chosen was about 8 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by high-clearance vehicles and a rough 4-wheel drive track. Perfect for someone wanting to experience the desert without crowds or developed facilities. I set up camp Friday evening in a clearing surrounded by mature saguaro cacti, some of them probably 200 years old. Desert camping requires careful site selection, level ground that won't flood during sudden storms, enough clearance from cacti to avoid accidents, and protection from prevailing winds. Saturday, I spent most of the day hiking and photographing the desert ecosystem. The Sonoran Desert in spring is spectacular. Palo Verde trees blooming yellow, barrel cacti producing bright red flowers, and if you're lucky, you might see some of the rare desert wildflowers that only appear after good winter rains. I followed several game trails and washes, covering maybe 6 miles total, while staying within a reasonable distance of camp. Good day of desert exploration, ending with sunset photos of the saguaro silhouettes against colorful sky. Sunday morning, I noticed something unusual near my campsite. Small green shoots were emerging from the desert soil along the exact route I'd hiked the day before. Not random desert seedlings. The plants were growing in a precise line that followed every turn, rest stop, and detour I'd made during Saturday's hike. At first, I assumed it was coincidental. Desert seeds can lie dormant for years, waiting for the right combination of moisture and temperature to germinate. Maybe my footsteps had somehow triggered germination in seeds that were already present in the soil, but the pattern was too precise to be natural. The seedlings formed a continuous line that matched my GPS track from Saturday's hike. Every place I'd stopped to take photos, there was a cluster of new growth. Every detour I'd made to examine interesting rock formations, the seedlings followed the exact same route. And they weren't random desert plants. They were all saguaro seedlings, identifiable by their distinctive first leaves and growth pattern. But saguaro cacti take decades to reach maturity, and their seeds require very specific conditions to germinate. Finding this many new seedlings in a concentrated area would be unusual under normal circumstances. Finding them arranged in the exact pattern of human footsteps was impossible. I documented the phenomenon with photos, marking the seedling locations with GPS coordinates. The correlation between plant growth and my hiking route was perfect. Not a single seedling appeared outside the path I had taken. Sunday afternoon, I expanded my investigation, hiking different routes to see if the pattern would continue. By Monday morning, new seedlings had appeared along Sunday's hiking routes too. Same species, same growth stage, same precise correlation with human foot traffic. Something was causing accelerated plant growth in response to human activity in the area. I searched for explanations. Desert biological systems are complex, with relationships between soil chemistry, moisture retention, and seed germination that could theoretically be influenced by human presence. But saguaro seeds don't germinate overnight, even under ideal conditions. The timeline I was observing suggested plant growth that was weeks or months faster than natural rates. Monday afternoon, I found the equipment that explained everything. Hidden among the rocks near my campsite were several small devices that looked like agricultural monitoring sensors. Solar-powered, wireless-enabled, and equipped with what appeared to be soil treatment capability. The devices were analyzing soil conditions along human travel routes and artificially accelerating plant germination through targeted application of growth hormones and nutrients. Someone was using my hiking patterns as data for a botanical modification experiment. I examined the devices more closely, documenting their specifications and installation locations. Professional agricultural equipment designed for precision soil treatment and plant growth acceleration. But what disturbed me most was the sophistication of the tracking system. The devices weren't just monitoring where I walked, they were predicting where I would go, pre-treating soil along likely routes before I actually hiked them. Like someone had studied my hiking patterns and developed algorithms to forecast my behavior. I followed the equipment network, finding additional devices scattered throughout the area, all connected by a wireless communication system that extended for several miles around my campsite. The entire desert area had been converted into a controlled agricultural experiment, using human visitors as unwitting test subjects for botanical modification research. Monday night, I tried to understand the purpose of the research. The accelerated plant growth wasn't random. It was creating specific patterns that corresponded to human activity, like someone was studying how to use plant growth as a tracking and monitoring system. Every place a person walked, touched, or spent time would be marked by accelerated botanical growth that could be detected and analyzed long after the human presence was gone. Natural surveillance, using plant growth patterns to monitor human activity in remote areas. But the system had capabilities beyond just tracking. The devices could modify plant growth in real time, creating botanical barriers or markers that could influence human movement patterns. Tuesday morning, I woke to find that new plant growth had appeared overnight in a pattern that blocked my planned hiking routes. Dense clusters of fast-growing desert shrubs had sprouted across the trails I'd intended to explore. The system wasn't just monitoring my movement, it was trying to control it. I packed immediately, preparing to leave the area before the botanical modifications could trap me in a maze of artificially accelerated plant growth. But as I loaded my truck, I could see new growth patterns forming around the campsite. Saguaro seedlings and desert shrubs arranged in concentric circles, like someone was using plant growth to mark territory or create boundaries. The smell of juniper sap was getting stronger, even though there were no juniper trees in the immediate area. Sharp and resinous, like someone was crushing evergreen plants nearby. I drove out on the four-wheel drive track, but noticed that new plant growth was appearing along the route even as I traveled. Fast-growing desert vegetation that could potentially block the road if the growth acceleration continued. By the time I reached paved highway, I could see in my rearview mirror that the entire area around my former campsite was changing color as new plant growth covered the landscape. A flash of distant lightning caught my attention as I drove away, though no storms were forecast for the area. When I checked my GPS later, I found that my evacuation route showed impossible loops and detours, like the device had been recording movement through areas I'd definitely never driven. Someone had been manipulating my navigation data the same way they'd been controlling plant growth patterns. I never went back to that area of the Sonoran Desert, but I researched botanical modification techniques and found references to experimental programs that used plant growth patterns for environmental monitoring and human tracking. Most of the research was classified or restricted, but the general concept was using accelerated plant growth as a natural surveillance system that could monitor remote areas without detection. Like someone was developing biological tracking methods that would appear to be natural phenomena to casual observers. I learned to pay attention to unusual plant growth patterns in natural areas, especially when those patterns seem too organized or too fast to be natural. Some gardens are better left unplanted. The printing press was producing pages from a diary I'd never written. Northern Wisconsin Paper operates a commercial printing facility outside Green Bay, handling everything from business cards to book publishing for clients across the upper Midwest. I worked night shift there for 18 months, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Tuesday through Saturday, press operator and quality control, making sure print jobs ran smoothly during overnight production. The main offset press could handle large volume jobs, magazines, catalogs, book printing. During night shifts, we usually ran long jobs that didn't require frequent operator attention, letting the automated systems handle most of the work, while I monitored quality and changed paper rolls. January 15th, I was running a book printing job when I noticed something odd in the output. Between chapters of the legitimate book, the press was producing additional pages that weren't part of the original print file. Text pages formatted like diary entries dated from the past 6 months. At first, I assumed it was a computer glitch, maybe leftover data in the system memory from a previous job. But when I read the content more carefully, I realized the diary entries were about me. Detailed descriptions of my daily routine, work schedule, even personal thoughts and observations I'd had, but never spoken aloud or written down anywhere. January 3rd. Difficult night at the press. Equipment running rough, but managed to complete the magazine job on schedule. Thinking about Sarah again. Probably should call her soon. I had been thinking about calling my ex-girlfriend Sarah on January 3rd, but I'd never written that thought down anywhere. Yet there it was, printed in professional typeset format, as if it were part of a legitimate publication. I stopped the press, examined the print file more carefully. According to the computer system, we were only printing the authorized book content, but the physical output included dozens of pages of personal diary entries, mixed in with the legitimate text. Someone had somehow inserted unauthorized content into the print job. Over the next hour, I found more personal entries scattered throughout the book pages, all written in first person, all describing my thoughts and activities with disturbing accuracy. January 8th. Night shift was quiet. Spent most of the time reading during equipment downtime, wondering if this job has a future, or if I should look for something with more advancement opportunities. January 12th. Called Mum. Talked about visiting for her birthday next month. She seemed tired. Need to check on her more often. These were accurate descriptions of conversations and thoughts from the past weeks, but presented as if I'd been keeping a detailed personal journal. I called my supervisor, reported the unauthorized content appearing in the print job. Printing presses don't create content, he said. They only reproduce what's in the digital files. If you're seeing extra pages, there's additional data somewhere in the system. The content is personal information about me. Someone's inserted surveillance data into the print job. I'll come in early, take a look. But secure the output. Don't let any unauthorized material leave the facility. While I waited for backup, I continued monitoring the press output. The personal diary entries kept appearing, mixed randomly with the legitimate book content. But the entries weren't just describing past events. Some of them were dated for future dates, describing activities and thoughts I hadn't had yet. January 16th, supervisor came in to investigate the printing issue. Seemed skeptical at first, but became more concerned after seeing the evidence. Decided to contact facility security about potential data breach. That entry was dated for tomorrow. but it described exactly what was happening during the current night shift. The printing system was somehow predicting future events and producing diary entries for situations that hadn't occurred yet. Around 3 a.m., my supervisor arrived with a team from IT security. They examined the printing equipment, analyzed the digital files, and traced the source of the unauthorized content. What they found was a comprehensive surveillance and data mining system that had been integrated into the facility's computer network. Someone's installed monitoring software throughout our entire system, the IT supervisor explained. It's collecting data about employee activities, analyzing communication patterns, even monitoring personal devices that connect to our Wi-Fi network. How are they creating the diary entries? The software uses natural language processing to convert surveillance data into readable text. It takes raw behavioral data and formats it as personal narrative, like someone was keeping a detailed journal. What about the future dated entries? Predictive algorithms. The system analyzes patterns in your behavior and generates probable future scenarios based on historical data. The team traced the surveillance network, found that it extended far beyond the printing facility. The monitoring system had access to personal devices, social media accounts, even financial and medical records. Someone was conducting comprehensive life surveillance on facility employees, using the printing equipment to demonstrate how much personal information they collected. This isn't just about printing, the supervisor said. The unauthorized content is a proof of concept, showing that they can access and analyze every aspect of your personal life. Around 5 a.m., we found the physical evidence. Hidden throughout the facility were small surveillance devices, cameras, microphones, even sensors that could monitor heart rate and stress levels, all connected to the main surveillance network and feeding data to the content generation system. The printing facility had been converted into a comprehensive human behavior research laboratory. But what disturbed me most was the quality of the personal predictions. The future dated diary entries weren't just random speculation. They showed detailed knowledge of my decision-making processes and psychological patterns. January 18th, decided to request transfer to day shift. The surveillance situation makes night work too uncomfortable. We'll probably look for a different job entirely if the situation isn't resolved. I hadn't made that decision yet, but reading the prediction made me realize it was exactly what I was planning to do. The surveillance system wasn't just monitoring my behavior. It was influencing my thinking by showing me predicted futures that felt inevitable. The smell of mouse nest ammonia got stronger near the surveillance devices, sharp and acrid, like small animals had been living in electrical equipment. But the building had regular pest control, and I'd never seen signs of rodent problems. When I checked the printing press output later, I found that some pages showed XCF metadata with impossible timestamps, dates and times that indicated the content had been created before the surveillance system was even installed, like someone had been collecting personal information about employees for much longer than the physical evidence suggested. Management shut down the printing facility for a week, while security specialists removed all unauthorized monitoring equipment and rebuilt the computer systems from scratch. I put in for a transfer to day shift, citing concerns about working alone with compromised surveillance systems, but the transfer was delayed while the investigation continued. The night shift replacement lasted 2 weeks before requesting a different assignment. Said the printing equipment made him uncomfortable, producing output that seemed too personal for industrial machinery. Facility management eventually implemented strict security protocols and regular surveillance sweeps. But according to current employees, the printing equipment occasionally still produces unauthorized content. Personal information about employees, formatted as diary entries or private correspondence. Always accurate, always more detailed than anyone should know about their co-workers' private lives. Like the surveillance modifications created permanent changes in the facility's data, handling capabilities that couldn't be completely eliminated through system rebuilds. I learned to pay attention to what industrial equipment produces, especially when the output includes information that shouldn't be available to mechanical systems. The floorboards were creaking in Morse code, transmitting my social security number. I'd rented the mountain cabin for a month-long writing retreat, a 19th century log structure about 15 miles southwest of Asheville in the North Carolina mountains. Perfect isolation for someone trying to finish a novel. No internet, minimal cell service, just wood heat and the kind of quiet you can only find in deep forest. The cabin was authentically rustic. Hand-hewn logs, wide plank floors, stone fireplace that provided the only heat source. The kind of place where every footstep produced creaks and settling sounds from wood that had been responding to weather changes for over a century. First 2 weeks, I got used to the normal cabin sounds. Floorboards that squeaked in predictable patterns, roof beams that groaned during temperature changes, walls that popped and cracked as the wood expanded and contracted. But around day 15, I started noticing patterns in the floorboard sounds that seemed too regular to be random settling. Late at night, when I was working on the novel, the floor would produce sequences of short and long creaks, rhythmic patterns that reminded me of telegraph communication. But I dismissed it as coincidence. Old buildings make all kinds of sounds, and the human brain is wired to find patterns, even in random noise. But Wednesday evening the pattern became unmistakable. I was sitting at the kitchen table typing on my laptop when the floorboards began a long sequence of coded creaks. Short, short, long, pause. Long, short, short, pause. Short, long, short. I know Morse code from my time in the military. The sequence was transmitting numbers, 4-7-3. Over the next hour, the floorboards continued transmitting numerical sequences. All the digits of my social security number delivered in perfect Morse code through wood settling sounds. But floorboards don't know social security numbers. I tested the phenomenon, walking around the cabin to see if my movements triggered the coded communications. But the Morse code transmissions seemed to be independent of my physical presence. They continued even when I was sitting perfectly still. The cabin was somehow accessing personal information and transmitting it through structural sounds. Thursday, I expanded my investigation, documenting the coded transmissions with audio recordings and written transcriptions. The information being transmitted was comprehensive and accurate. My full name in Morse code, my birth date and place of birth, current address and phone number, even my military service record number, which I hadn't used or referenced in years. The cabin had access to detailed personal information that wasn't stored anywhere on the property. I examined the floorboards more closely, looking for electronic devices that might be creating the coded sounds. Found several small mechanisms hidden beneath the floor planks. Sophisticated equipment that could create controlled settling sounds by applying precise pressure to specific boards. The devices were connected by a network of thin wires running beneath the entire floor system. Someone had converted the cabin's structural elements into a comprehensive communication system. But the information being transmitted suggested the devices had access to government databases, financial records, even classified military files. This wasn't amateur surveillance. It was professional-grade intelligence gathering. Friday evening, the transmissions evolved beyond static personal information. Instead of just sending stored data, the floorboards started transmitting real-time information. My current activities, typed conversations from my laptop, even phone calls I was making despite the limited cell service. The cabin was conducting active surveillance and broadcasting the results through structural sounds that would seem natural to anyone not familiar with Morse code. Perfect camouflaged intelligence operation, using building sounds to transmit surveillance data without detection. I tried to disable the devices, but removing the first mechanism triggered an emergency response. The entire floor system began transmitting rapid-fire Morse code, broadcasting what appeared to be distress signals. Within an hour, I heard vehicles approaching on the mountain access road. 2 SUVs with government license plates, moving slowly like they were conducting surveillance. Someone was monitoring the cabin's communication system and responding to tampering attempts. I left the devices alone and returned to normal activities, but continued documenting the transmissions. The intelligence operation was more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. Saturday, I discovered the full extent of the surveillance network. The coded transmissions weren't just coming from the floorboards. The roof beams were transmitting additional information in a different code. Even the stone fireplace was producing rhythmic sounds that corresponded to encrypted data transmission. The entire cabin had been converted into a communication facility, with every structural element participating in intelligence gathering and data transmission. But what disturbed me most was the quality of the information being transmitted. The surveillance system had access to thoughts and intentions I hadn't expressed verbally or digitally. Private concerns about my writing career, relationship anxieties I hadn't shared with anyone, even creative ideas I was considering for future projects. The cabin was somehow monitoring and transmitting psychological data that shouldn't have been accessible through conventional surveillance methods. Sunday night, I found evidence of the data collection mechanism. Hidden in the fireplace chimney were sensors that could monitor stress hormones, emotional states, even brain activity patterns, advanced biometric equipment that could analyze psychological states based on physical indicators. The cabin wasn't just observing my behavior, it was reading my emotional and mental states, then transmitting that information through structural communication systems. Perfect psychological surveillance disguised as the normal sounds of an old mountain cabin. Around midnight, the moon broke through clouds that had been obscuring the sky all evening. In that silver light, I could see movement in the forest around the cabin. Human figures positioning electronic equipment and monitoring the building's data transmissions. The intelligence operation was active, with field operatives managing the surveillance network in real time. I packed essential items and prepared to leave immediately. Whatever research was being conducted in the mountain cabin, I didn't want to be a subject of further psychological monitoring. As I loaded my car, the cabin's structural communication system activated with an urgent transmission pattern. Rapid Morse code broadcasting what appeared to be my departure plans, vehicle description, even my intended evacuation route. The surveillance system was providing real-time intelligence about my movements to the field operatives positioned in the surrounding forest. I drove out on dark mountain roads, using GPS navigation to avoid the routes the cabin had predicted. But throughout the drive, I could hear electronic sounds from the forest. Communication equipment transmitting updates about my location and direction. The intelligence operation extended far beyond the cabin itself, covering the entire mountain area with surveillance capabilities. By the time I reached the interstate, the electronic sounds had stopped. I drove straight home, but kept checking my rearview mirror for the first 100 miles. A month later, I received a check from the cabin rental company, refunding my unused rent with a note explaining that the property had been temporarily removed from service for structural repairs. But when I researched the property ownership, I found it was registered to a company that didn't exist at an address that had never been built. The mountain cabin was apparently part of an intelligence operation that used vacation rental properties for psychological surveillance of unsuspecting civilians. I learned to pay attention to the sounds that old buildings make, especially when those sounds seem more organized than natural settling should produce. My reflection in the lake was carrying equipment I'd left at home. I'd hiked into the Sawtooth Wilderness for a 4-day solo backpacking trip, planning to camp at Mirror Lake and explore the surrounding alpine basin. August weather was perfect for high country hiking. Warm days, cool nights, and most of the snow had melted from the higher elevations. The 8-mile hike in was straightforward, following well-maintained trails through dense forest before climbing above tree line into the alpine zone. Mirror Lake sat at about 9,500 feet elevation, surrounded by granite peaks and fed by snowmelt from the surrounding cirque. I set up camp Friday evening on the north shore of the lake, about 50 yards back from the water. Standard backpacking setup, lightweight tent, sleeping bag rated for mountain conditions, white gas stove for cooking. Everything I needed for 4 days of self-sufficient wilderness camping. The lake was perfectly still that evening, creating mirror-like reflections of the surrounding peaks. That's how Mirror Lake got its name. On calm days, the water surface becomes so reflective, you can barely tell where the mountains end and their reflections begin. Saturday morning, I was filtering water at the lake edge when I first noticed something odd about my reflection. In the clear water surface, I could see myself kneeling with the water filter, but the reflection showed me carrying different equipment. Instead of my lightweight day pack, the reflection showed a large expedition backpack. Instead of my regular hiking clothes, the reflection wore cold weather gear appropriate for winter conditions. I looked up from the water, checked my actual equipment. I was definitely wearing summer hiking clothes and carrying my small day pack, but when I looked back at the reflection, it continued to show winter gear and expedition equipment. The reflection wasn't matching my actual appearance. I tested the phenomenon, moving different pieces of equipment into view of the water surface. Each time, the reflection would show modified or substituted gear. When I held up my lightweight sleeping bag, the reflection showed a heavy winter bag. When I displayed my 3-season tent, the reflection showed a 4-season mountaineering shelter. Even my cooking equipment appeared different in the reflection. Expedition-grade gear instead of the ultralight backpacking stove I was actually using. The lake was somehow showing an alternate version of my camping setup, equipped for more extreme conditions than I was actually prepared for. Saturday afternoon, I decided to document the phenomenon systematically. I arranged all my camping gear near the lakeshore, taking photos of both the actual equipment and its reflections in the water surface. The correlation was consistent. Every piece of gear appeared different in the reflection. But what bothered me was that the reflected equipment wasn't random. It represented a complete camping system appropriate for winter mountaineering conditions, like someone had carefully selected substitute gear that would be more suitable for extreme weather camping. Sunday, I found evidence that explained the reflection anomaly. While exploring the area around the lake, I discovered a cache of camping equipment hidden among the rocks on the far shore. Professional mountaineering gear, exactly matching what I'd seen in the lake reflections. Someone had been monitoring my camping setup and had pre-positioned superior equipment as potential replacements. The cache included detailed notes about my hiking patterns, equipment choices, even my level of wilderness experience. Like someone had been studying my outdoor skills and preparing upgraded gear to match my activities. But who would monitor recreational backpackers and maintain equipment caches in remote wilderness areas? I examined the cached equipment more closely, looking for identifying marks or manufacturer information. Found several items that had been modified with electronic tracking devices. The upgraded gear wasn't just better equipment. It was instrumented for comprehensive monitoring of user behavior and location. Someone was using equipment substitution as a method for surveillance and data collection in wilderness areas. Sunday evening, I tested the system by deliberately camping with some of the cached equipment instead of my own gear. The lake reflections immediately normalized, showing the actual equipment I was using instead of the substitute versions. But other things changed too. The reflective tacks I used to mark my campsite boundaries had been repositioned to optimize the reflection angles from the lake surface, like someone had been fine-tuning the visual monitoring capabilities. Around sunset, I noticed electronic sounds coming from the equipment I'd taken from the cache. Subtle beeping patterns that sounded like data transmission signals. The instrumented gear was broadcasting information about my activities, location, even biometric data collected through contact sensors built into the equipment. Monday morning, I decided to leave the area immediately. The equipment substitution program represented a level of wilderness surveillance that made me uncomfortable. Someone was monitoring recreational activities in remote areas and using gear substitution to collect detailed data about individual hikers and campers. As I packed to leave, I noticed that my original equipment had been modified during the night. Small electronic devices had been attached to my sleeping bag, backpack, even my hiking boots. The surveillance system wasn't just offering equipment upgrades. It was modifying existing gear to ensure continued monitoring, regardless of whether hikers accepted the substitute equipment. I removed the electronic devices and documented their specifications, but kept copies of the data they'd collected. Evidence of comprehensive wilderness surveillance that extended far beyond simple equipment monitoring. The hike out was complicated by electronic interference with my GPS unit. The device kept showing incorrect locations and routing me toward areas that didn't match my intended exit strategy. Someone was using the electronic modifications to influence navigation decisions, potentially directing hikers toward additional monitoring stations or equipment cache locations. Around noon, I encountered other hikers on the trail, the first people I'd seen since entering the wilderness area. But when I tried to warn them about the surveillance equipment, they seemed already aware of the situation. "We're part of the research program," one of them explained. "Voluntary participants in a wilderness safety and equipment optimization study." "What kind of research?" "Analyzing how equipment choices affect safety outcomes in remote wilderness areas. The data helps improve gear design and wilderness safety protocols." But when I asked for details about the research organization or oversight protocols, they became evasive. The equipment substitution program was apparently larger than I'd initially realized, involving multiple participants across various wilderness areas. I reached the trailhead Monday afternoon, but found that my vehicle had been modified during my absence. Electronic tracking devices attached to the undercarriage. even a GPS monitoring system integrated into the vehicle's electrical system. The wilderness surveillance program extended into personal property monitoring, ensuring continued data collection after participants left the remote study areas. I removed what devices I could find and drove home, but remained concerned about the scope of the surveillance network and its purposes. A month later, I received contact from researchers claiming to be conducting legitimate wilderness safety studies. They offered payment for participation in their equipment testing programs. But when I researched the organization, I found no legitimate academic or government affiliations. The wilderness surveillance program appeared to be privately funded, with undisclosed objectives and no apparent oversight. I learned to pay attention to equipment reflections in wilderness water sources, especially when those reflections suggest gear you don't actually own. Some upgrades come with costs that aren't immediately apparent. The molten steel was cooling into letter shapes that spelled out my name. Bethlehem Steel operates a specialty metals facility outside Pittsburgh, producing custom alloys and precision castings for aerospace and defense applications. I worked night shift there for 3 years, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Wednesday through Sunday, furnace operator and quality control, monitoring the steel production process during overnight operations. The Maine electric arc furnace could melt about 50 tons of scrap steel per batch, reaching temperatures over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. During normal operation, the molten metal was poured into standardized molds to create ingots and specialty shapes for further processing. The cooling patterns were predictable. Molten steel solidifies from the outside in, creating consistent grain structures and surface textures. After 15 years of metallurgy work, I could predict how any given pour would solidify based on temperature, composition, and cooling conditions. February 8th, I was monitoring a routine stainless steel pour when I noticed something unusual in the cooling patterns. Instead of solidifying uniformly, the molten metal was forming distinct shapes as it cooled. Not random patterns, deliberate letter forms that looked like someone was writing in liquid steel. The first batch formed the letter D in raised relief across the surface of the cooling ingot. I assumed it was coincidental. Sometimes impurities or temperature variations can create unusual patterns in cooling metal, but the letter formation was too precise to be accidental. The second pour formed the letter A with the same clarity and deliberate appearance. By the fourth pour, the message was clear. Dave, my name, spelled out in cooled steel across 4 separate ingots. Someone was controlling the cooling process to create letter patterns in the molten metal. I examined the cooling systems more carefully, looking for modifications that might allow precise control over solidification patterns. Found several unauthorized devices connected to the cooling water circulation system. Sophisticated equipment that could create localized temperature variations in the cooling molds, allowing controlled manipulation of the solidification process. Someone had converted the steel production facility into a massive printing system, using molten metal as the medium for creating written messages. I documented the letter formations with photos, then called my supervisor to report the equipment modifications. Steel doesn't form letters, he said. There must be a problem with the molds or cooling system. The letters are perfect. Someone's controlling the cooling process to create deliberate patterns. I'll come in early, take a look, but secure all the output. We can't ship products with unusual surface patterns. While I waited for backup, I continued the production run. Each pour continued creating letter patterns, but now the messages were becoming more complex. Instead of just my name, The cooling steel was forming complete words and sentences. Night shift operator. 15 years experience. Lives on Maple Street. Personal information that wasn't stored anywhere in the facility's computer systems. Around 2 a.m., my supervisor arrived with a team from the metallurgy department. They examined the letter-formed ingots, analyzed the cooling system modifications, and traced the source of the temperature control equipment. "This is precision metallurgy," the chief metallurgist said. "Whoever installed this equipment understands steel chemistry and cooling dynamics better than most of our engineers." How are they creating the letter patterns? Controlled cooling rates in specific areas of the molds. By varying the temperature locally, they can influence grain structure and surface formation during solidification. What about the personal information? The control system has network connectivity. It's receiving data from external sources and converting it into metallurgical instructions. The team traced the network connections, found that the steel production facility had been integrated into a larger data collection and communication system. The molten metal messaging wasn't just a demonstration of metallurgical control. It was proof of comprehensive surveillance and data access capabilities. "They're not just forming letters," the supervisor explained. "They're showing that they can access personal information and display it through industrial processes." Around 4 a.m. we discovered the full scope of the modifications. The unauthorized equipment wasn't just controlling steel cooling. It had integrated with the entire production process. Temperature control, chemical composition, even the timing of metal pours could be manipulated to create specific patterns and messages. The steel mill had been converted into a massive communication device capable of encoding information into physical metal products. But what disturbed me most was the accuracy of the personal information being encoded. The molten metal messages included details about my family, financial information, even medical records that should have been confidential. Someone had comprehensive access to personal databases and was using industrial metallurgy to demonstrate their surveillance capabilities. The smell of wet rock and iron got stronger near the modified cooling systems, sharp and metallic like blood, mixed with mineral water. But steel production facilities always have strong metallic odors, so it was easy to dismiss as normal industrial atmosphere. Around 5 a.m., the messages became more threatening. Instead of neutral personal information, the cooling steel started forming warnings and instructions. "Stop investigating. Return to normal duties. Forget what you have seen." The surveillance system was responding to my documentation activities in real time, creating intimidation messages through the steel production process. When I tried to photograph the threatening messages, something strange happened to my camera. The digital display showed images of steel ingots with different letter patterns than what I was actually seeing. Like the surveillance system was manipulating my documentation equipment to prevent accurate recording of the threats. My supervisor decided to shut down the entire production line until the unauthorized modifications could be removed. But when we tried to disable the cooling control equipment, the entire furnace system went into emergency mode. Alarm sounding, automatic safety shutdowns, even emergency calls to the local fire department. Someone was monitoring the facility's operations and responding aggressively to interference with their communication system. The chair in the control room had been repositioned while we were investigating the equipment modifications. Instead of facing the control panels, it was turned to face the furnace area where the molten metal messages were being formed. Like someone had been sitting there, watching the letter formation process and directing the message content. Management decided to bring in federal investigators, citing concerns about industrial espionage and unauthorized access to production systems. The facility was shut down for 2 weeks while security specialists removed all unauthorized equipment and rebuilt the computer networks. I put in for a transfer to day shift, citing concerns about working alone with compromised industrial systems. The psychological pressure of seeing personal information encoded in molten metal was affecting my ability to focus on normal production tasks. The night shift replacement lasted 1 month before requesting a different assignment. Said the steel production process made him uncomfortable, creating patterns that seemed too deliberate for normal metallurgical operations. Facility management eventually implemented comprehensive security protocols and regular equipment inspections, but according to current employees, the molten metal occasionally still forms unusual patterns during cooling. Letters, symbols, even complex geometric shapes that suggest continued unauthorized control over the metallurgical processes. Like the surveillance modifications created permanent changes in the steel production capabilities that couldn't be completely eliminated through equipment replacement. I learned to pay attention to patterns in industrial processes, especially when those patterns seemed too organized to be natural material behavior. The air conditioner was humming songs from musicals my grandmother took me to see. I'd rented the swampland cottage for 2 months, looking for somewhere isolated to work on a novel while dealing with some personal issues after my divorce. The place was about 30 miles southwest of Gainesville, accessible only by a gravel road that wound through cypress swamps and palmetto scrub. Perfect isolation for someone who needed to focus on writing without distractions from normal life. The cottage was basic but functional. 1960s construction, window air conditioning units, screen porch overlooking a small lake. The kind of place where you could hear every night sound from the surrounding swamp, but no traffic or neighbor noise to interfere with creative work. The main air conditioning unit was an older model that ran almost constantly during Florida's humid summer months. Like most window units, it produced a steady mechanical hum when operating, white noise that actually helped with concentration while writing. Third week, I started noticing musical patterns in the AC's mechanical hum. Late at night, when I was working on difficult chapters, the air conditioner would produce harmonic variations that sounded almost like melodies, faint but distinct musical phrases embedded in the usual mechanical drone. At first, I assumed it was psychological, stress from the divorce and writing deadline making me hear patterns in random noise, but the melodies were too clear, too structured to be coincidental. The air conditioner was humming Edelweiss from The Sound of Music. That got my attention because it wasn't a song I'd heard recently or been thinking about, but it was a melody I remembered from childhood. My grandmother had taken me to see The Sound of Music on Broadway when I was 8 years old. Over the next few nights, the musical patterns became more frequent and more recognizable. Memory from Cats. Sunrise, Sunset from Fiddler on the Roof. The Way You Look Tonight from Swing Time. All songs from musicals my grandmother had taken me to see during childhood trips to New York City. Specific performances, specific memories from over 30 years ago. The air conditioner somehow had detailed knowledge of my personal entertainment history. I tested the phenomenon, trying to understand how the musical patterns were being created. The melodies weren't random. They followed the original arrangements and musical phrasing from the Broadway productions I'd actually attended. But here's what really bothered me. The songs weren't just generic versions. They reproduced the specific vocal characteristics and orchestral arrangements from the particular performances I'd seen as a child. like someone had recorded those exact theatrical performances and was now playing them back through the air conditioning system's mechanical harmonics. Around the fourth week, I started keeping detailed notes about the musical phenomena. The songs always appeared late at night when I was writing or trying to sleep. They seemed to correlate with my emotional state, uplifting songs during productive writing sessions, melancholy ballads when I was struggling with personal issues. The air conditioning system was somehow monitoring my psychological condition and selecting appropriate musical content to influence my mood. But the emotional manipulation was subtle and effective. Hearing the sound of music would trigger positive memories of time with my grandmother. Memory from cats would evoke feelings about lost relationships and the need for healing. Perfect psychological conditioning delivered through mechanical sounds that seem natural and unobtrusive. I searched the cottage for monitoring equipment, thinking someone might have installed surveillance devices that were collecting emotional data. Found several small electronic components hidden inside the air conditioning unit. Sophisticated audio processing equipment that could analyze the AC's mechanical harmonics and modify them to create musical patterns. But the devices had access to information that shouldn't have been available to surveillance equipment. Detailed records of specific Broadway performances from the 1980s and 1990s, audio recordings of musical arrangements from shows I'd attended as a child, even psychological profiles that correlated my emotional responses to different musical genres. Someone had been collecting comprehensive entertainment surveillance data about my personal history for decades. Around the fifth week, the musical manipulation became more aggressive. Instead of just playing familiar songs, the air conditioner started producing medleys that told emotional narratives. Musical sequences designed to evoke specific memories and emotional responses. Songs about family relationships during times when I was struggling with loneliness. Romantic ballads during periods when I was processing divorce-related emotions. Uplifting anthems when I needed motivation to continue writing. The system was using musical psychology to manipulate my emotional state in real time, probably trying to influence my creative output and personal decision-making. I tried to disable the audio modification equipment, but the air conditioning unit was integrated into the cottage's electrical system. Removing the musical devices would disable the cooling system entirely. Someone had designed the cottage specifically for psychological manipulation through environmental control, using air conditioning as the delivery system for emotional conditioning. 6th week, I found evidence of the broader surveillance network. The musical manipulation wasn't just about entertainment history. It was part of a comprehensive psychological profile that included my creative habits, emotional triggers, even my responses to different types of environmental stress. The cottage was a laboratory for studying how environmental manipulation could influence creative output and personal decision-making in isolated individuals. But what disturbed me most was discovering that the musical selections were becoming predictive. The air conditioner would start playing songs that corresponded to emotions I was about to experience, or musical themes that related to creative ideas I was developing. Like the system was monitoring my thoughts and using musical cues to influence the direction of my writing and personal reflection. Around the 7th week, distant lightning began appearing nightly despite clear weather forecasts. When I checked my GPS during these lightning events, it would show impossible location data, coordinates that placed the cottage in different states or even different countries. The psychological manipulation system included environmental effects and navigation disruption designed to increase isolation and dependency on the controlled environment. I I packed and left immediately, driving out during daylight hours when the psychological pressure was minimal. The air conditioning system played a musical farewell as I loaded my belongings, a medley of songs about leaving and new beginnings, perfectly timed to my departure schedule. Someone had been monitoring my packing activities and preparing appropriate emotional soundtrack for my evacuation. A month later, I received contact from researchers claiming to study the relationship between environmental factors and creative productivity. They offered payment for participation in a writing retreat program at isolated locations. But when I researched the organization, I found connections to psychological research programs that used environmental manipulation for behavioral modification studies. The swampland cottage was apparently part of a larger network of controlled environments designed for studying human responses to subtle psychological pressure techniques. I learned to pay attention to musical patterns in mechanical systems, especially when those patterns seemed to know more about my personal history than they should. My GPS track log was drawing a detailed portrait of my face across the desert landscape. I'd driven down to the Devil's Garden area for a long weekend of desert camping and photography, planning to explore some of the less traveled areas around Arches National Park. October weather was perfect for Utah desert camping. Warm days, cool nights, and clear skies that made GPS navigation reliable in the remote backcountry. The camping area I'd chosen was about 12 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by four-wheel drive tracks that wind through red rock formations and sagebrush flats. Perfect terrain for someone wanting solitude and dramatic landscape photography. I'd been using GPS navigation for backcountry travel for over 10 years, always keeping detailed track logs of my routes for safety and future reference. Standard practice in desert country, where landmarks can be confusing and weather can change navigation conditions quickly. Saturday, I spent most of the day hiking and photographing the area's signature rock formations. The GPS unit tracked my movements automatically, creating a breadcrumb trail that I could follow back to camp or use for planning future trips to the area. Evening, I downloaded the day's GPS data to my laptop, checking the track log for accuracy and noting any interesting waypoints I'd marked during the hike. That's when I noticed something odd about the coordinate pattern. Instead of the random wandering routes typical of wilderness hiking, my GPS track formed organized geometric shapes, not just simple patterns, complex, detailed designs that looked almost artistic. I plotted the coordinates on mapping software, trying to understand what I was seeing. The GPS track log was drawing a portrait, a detailed, recognizable image of a human face, created by the precise sequence of coordinates recorded during my day hike. But not just any face. The portrait was unmistakably me. Accurate facial proportions, distinctive features, even expressions that matched photos I had taken of myself during the hike. My GPS unit had somehow recorded a hiking route that created an artistic representation of my own face across several square miles of Utah desert. Sunday, I tested the phenomenon, deliberately hiking random routes to see if the GPS would continue creating artistic patterns. But instead of following my actual movements, the GPS continued recording coordinates that contributed to the facial portrait. Even when I hiked north, the GPS would show movement toward the south, adding details to the artistic pattern regardless of my actual direction. The navigation system was being manipulated by external signals that overrode my actual location data. I examined the GPS unit more carefully, looking for signs of tampering or modification. The device appeared normal, but when I checked the satellite reception indicators, something was wrong. Instead of receiving signals from the standard GPS satellite constellation, the unit was tracking satellites that weren't in the correct orbital positions. The navigation data was coming from sources other than legitimate GPS satellites. Someone was broadcasting spoofed GPS signals that created artificial location data, designed to draw specific patterns regardless of actual user movement. Sunday afternoon, I found the source of the GPS spoofing. Hidden among the red rock formations were several small transmitters, positioned to create overlapping signal coverage throughout the area. Professional equipment designed to override legitimate GPS signals and substitute artificial location data. The desert camping area had been converted into a controlled navigation environment where GPS units would record predetermined coordinate patterns instead of actual user locations. But what disturbed me most was the sophistication of the artistic pattern. Creating a recognizable portrait through GPS coordinates required detailed knowledge of mapping software, coordinate geometry, and artistic composition. Someone with advanced technical skills had spent considerable time developing a system that could create GPS art using unsuspecting visitors as unwitting participants. Sunday evening, I tried to understand the purpose of the GPS manipulation system. The artistic patterns weren't random. They required visitors to follow specific movement patterns over extended periods. The system was studying human navigation behavior and using that information to create predetermined artistic outcomes. Like someone was researching how to control human movement through GPS manipulation, using artistic creation as a proof of concept for more sophisticated behavioral control systems. But the portrait creation also demonstrated comprehensive surveillance capabilities. The artistic pattern included facial details that suggested access to photographs and personal identification information. Someone was combining GPS manipulation with personal surveillance to create customized artistic experiences for individual visitors. Monday morning, I decided to leave the area immediately. The GPS spoofing system represented a level of navigation control that made wilderness travel unsafe. If someone could override GPS signals to create artistic patterns, they could also misdirect travelers toward dangerous terrain or away from emergency evacuation routes. But as I prepared to leave, the GPS manipulation became more aggressive. Instead of just creating artistic patterns, the system started providing false navigation information that would direct me away from the exit routes. The GPS showed roads and trails that didn't exist, or indicated that safe routes were impassable. The navigation control system was trying to keep me in the area, probably to complete the artistic pattern or continue the behavioral research study. I switched to manual navigation using paper maps and compass bearings, but found that even my vehicle's GPS system was being affected by the spoofing signals. The entire area was saturated with false navigation data designed to confuse and misdirect anyone trying to leave. Around noon, I encountered other visitors who seemed unaware of the GPS problems. When I tried to warn them about the navigation spoofing, they said they were part of a wilderness art project that used GPS tracking to create large-scale environmental artwork. It's a legitimate research program, one of them explained. We're studying the intersection between technology and landscape art. But when I asked for details about the research organization or safety protocols, they became evasive. The GPS manipulation system was apparently part of a larger program that recruited both voluntary and involuntary participants for navigation control experiments. I eventually found an exit route using traditional navigation methods, but noticed that my vehicle was being followed by unmarked vehicles that maintained precise distances and coordination. The GPS spoofing operation included human surveillance teams that monitored participants and ensured continued involvement in the behavioral research program. When I reached paved roads and legitimate GPS coverage, I found that my navigation system had recorded impossible track logs during the evacuation, coordinates that showed me driving through areas where no roads existed or following routes that would have required travel through solid rock formations. The GPS spoofing equipment had continued manipulating my navigation data even after I'd left the controlled area, probably to confuse documentation of the research site location. A month later, I received contact from researchers claiming to study GPS accuracy in challenging terrain environments. They offered payment for participation in navigation testing programs in remote desert areas. But when I researched the organization, I found connections to military contractors and defense research programs that use GPS manipulation for behavioral control studies. The Devil's Garden GPS spoofing operation was apparently part of a larger research network studying how navigation manipulation could influence human behavior and movement patterns. I learned to verify GPS accuracy against traditional navigation methods, especially in remote areas where signal manipulation might be used for research or surveillance purposes. The wood grain in every board was forming letters that spelled out where I grew up. Pacific Northwest Lumber operates a sawmill facility about 40 miles east of Portland, processing Douglas fir and cedar from managed forest lands throughout the Oregon Cascades. I worked night shift there for 2 years, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Monday through Friday. Quality control and lumber grading, ensuring that processed boards met specification requirements for construction and manufacturing customers. Wood grain patterns are as individual as fingerprints. Each tree develops unique growth patterns based on local climate, soil conditions, and environmental stresses over decades of growth. Reading grain patterns is essential for lumber grading, helping identify structural strengths and potential defects in finished boards. After 20 years of forestry work, I could read wood grain like text. Tight growth rings indicating drought years, irregular patterns showing wind stress or disease, even specific marks left by insect damage or fire exposure. March 3rd, I was grading a batch of Douglas fir boards when I noticed something unusual in the grain patterns. Instead of the random organic designs typical of natural wood grain, several boards showed patterns that looked almost like letters, not accidental resemblances, deliberate letter forms embedded in the growth rings. The first board spelled Salem in clear, readable letters formed by the arrangement of annual growth rings. Salem, Oregon, the city where I'd grown up, but left 25 years ago. I examined the board more carefully, trying to understand how natural tree growth could create such specific letter patterns. The wood was legitimate Douglas fir, showing normal cellular structure and growth characteristics. But the letter formation was too precise to be coincidental. Over the next hour, I found more boards with letter patterns in the grain. Oak Street appeared in a cedar plank. House number 847 formed in another Douglas fir board. All details about my childhood home address, encoded in the wood grain of trees that had been growing for decades in Oregon forests. I called my supervisor, reported the unusual grain patterns. "Wood doesn't spell words," he said. "You're probably seeing patterns that aren't really there. happens sometimes when you've been grading lumber for too long. The letters are clear and readable. This isn't pareidolia. Document what you're seeing, but keep processing the batch. We'll look at it more closely during day shift. I spent the rest of the night documenting the letterform boards, taking photos and noting the specific text that appeared in each piece of lumber. The information was comprehensive and accurate. Not just my childhood address, but details about family members, school attendance, even specific events from my youth that I'd never discussed with co-workers. The trees had somehow been encoding personal information about me during their decades of growth. Tuesday night, I expanded my investigation, examining lumber from different forest sources and age groups. Found personal information about other facility employees encoded in the wood grain of boards processed from various Oregon forests. Childhood addresses, family details, educational background, all embedded in the natural growth patterns of trees harvested across the region. Someone was using forest management techniques to encode personal information into tree growth, then processing that information through commercial lumber operations. Wednesday, I found evidence of the biological encoding system. While examining the cut surfaces of recently processed logs, I discovered small devices embedded in the wood, sophisticated sensors that could monitor and influence tree growth patterns over extended periods. The devices were designed to integrate with natural wood cellular structure, becoming part of the tree's biological system, while controlling the formation of growth rings and grain patterns. Someone had been installing biological modification equipment in the forest trees, programming them to encode specific information during natural growth processes. But what disturbed me most was the timeline involved. The trees showing encoded information had been growing for 30 to 50 years, suggesting the biological modification program had been operating for decades. Someone had been conducting long-term biological surveillance, using forest resources to create permanent records of personal information about individuals. Wednesday night, I traced the device's network connections, finding that they were linked to a comprehensive forestry monitoring system that covered thousands of acres of Oregon timberland. The biological encoding wasn't limited to a few trees. It was a region-wide program that had converted entire forests into biological data storage and surveillance systems. Thursday, I found that the encoded information wasn't just about facility employees. The lumber contained personal details about hundreds of individuals, residents of Oregon communities, visitors to forest areas, even people who had moved away decades ago but maintained connections to the region. The biological surveillance system had been collecting and encoding comprehensive population data, using tree growth as a permanent storage medium that would preserve information for decades or centuries. Around midnight Thursday, I noticed that some of the encoded information included impossible details, future addresses for people who hadn't moved yet, educational achievements that individuals hadn't completed, even personal decisions that people were apparently going to make but hadn't made yet. The biological encoding system wasn't just recording historical information, it was somehow predicting future developments and encoding them into current tree growth. Friday morning, I found the control facility for the biological encoding network. Hidden in the forest about 10 miles from the sawmill was a research station equipped with sophisticated forestry modification equipment. Professional biological laboratory designed for genetic manipulation and growth pattern control. The station was monitoring thousands of trees throughout the region, using satellite communication and biological sensors to control growth patterns and information encoding. But when I tried to document the facility, something strange happened to my camera. The digital images showed empty forest instead of the research station, even though I was clearly looking at buildings and equipment. Like the biological surveillance system included countermeasures to prevent documentation of the encoding network. The smell of mouse nest ammonia got stronger near the biological modification equipment, sharp and acrid, like small animals had been living in laboratory environments. But research facilities usually maintain strict pest control protocols. When I checked the metadata on my camera images later, I found impossible timestamps, photos that had been taken before I'd entered the forest area, or during times when I was documentably somewhere else. The biological surveillance system included digital manipulation capabilities designed to prevent accurate recording of the research activities. Management shut down the sawmill for a week, while environmental investigators examined the biological encoding evidence and traced the modification network. I put in for a transfer to day shift, citing concerns about working with lumber that contained encoded surveillance information. The psychological pressure of reading personal details in wood grain was affecting my ability to focus on normal quality control tasks. The night shift replacement lasted 3 weeks before requesting a different assignment. Said the lumber grading process made him uncomfortable, finding too much personal information encoded in the wood grain patterns. Facility management eventually implemented comprehensive testing protocols to identify lumber with unusual grain patterns. But according to current employees, boards with encoded information continue to appear in production batches. Personal details about employees, community members, even visitors to forest areas, all embedded in the natural growth patterns of trees processed through commercial lumber operations. Like the biological modification program, created permanent changes in regional forest ecosystems that continue to encode and preserve surveillance information through natural growth processes. I learned to pay attention to patterns in organic materials, especially when those patterns seem to contain information that shouldn't be naturally occurring. The waves were breaking against the rocks in perfect Morse code, transmitting my bank account number. I'd rented the coastal cottage for the entire summer, looking for somewhere quiet to work on a novel while dealing with some career transitions. The place was about 15 miles northeast of Bar Harbor, positioned right on the rocky Maine coast with unobstructed views of the Atlantic Ocean. Perfect writing environment. The sound of waves breaking against granite rocks provided natural white noise that helped with concentration, and the isolation meant no distractions from normal urban life. The cottage was a traditional Maine design, built in the 1940s by someone who understood coastal living. Solid construction that could handle Atlantic storms, large windows facing the ocean, and a covered porch where you could sit and watch the tides change throughout the day. The ocean sounds were one of the main attractions. Constant, rhythmic waves that followed predictable tidal patterns, louder during incoming tides, quieter during low tide periods. Natural soundtrack that varied with weather conditions and seasonal changes. Third week, I started noticing patterns in the wave sounds that seemed too regular to be natural. Late at night, when I was working on difficult chapters, the waves would break against the rocks in precise rhythmic sequences. Short crashes followed by longer pauses, then rapid series of smaller waves. Like someone was controlling the timing of wave impacts to create communication patterns. I know Morse code from my time in the Coast Guard Reserve. The wave patterns were definitely transmitting coded signals, but I initially dismissed it as coincidence. Ocean waves create all kinds of rhythmic patterns based on tidal forces, wind conditions, and underwater geology. Finding apparent communication signals in natural wave action was probably just pattern recognition running wild. But fourth week, the Morse code became unmistakable. The waves were transmitting numerical sequences in perfect Morse code: 4-7-3-2-9-1-8-5. My bank account number. Over the next few nights, the wave patterns continued transmitting personal financial information. Bank routing numbers, credit card accounts, even investment portfolio details that should have been confidential. The ocean was somehow accessing my financial records and broadcasting them through controlled wave timing. I examined the shoreline more carefully, looking for equipment that might be creating artificial wave patterns. Found several underwater devices positioned among the rocks where waves typically broke most forcefully. Sophisticated equipment designed to influence wave timing and impact patterns through controlled water displacement. Someone had converted the natural coastline into a massive Morse code transmission system, but the personal information being transmitted suggested access to comprehensive financial databases that should have been secured against unauthorized access. This wasn't amateur surveillance. It was professional-grade intelligence gathering, using oceanic manipulation as the communication medium. Fifth week, the transmissions expanded beyond financial information. The wave patterns started broadcasting personal details from medical records, employment history, even private communications I'd had with family members. Comprehensive personal surveillance, delivered through the natural sound of ocean waves breaking against Maine granite. Perfect camouflaged intelligence operation. Who would suspect ocean waves of transmitting coded personal information? I tried to document the phenomenon, recording wave sounds and analyzing the timing patterns. But when I played back the recordings, they showed normal random wave patterns instead of the organized Morse code sequences I was hearing in real time. Someone was manipulating my recording equipment to prevent accurate documentation of the wave-based surveillance system. Sixth week, I found evidence of the broader oceanic modification network. The underwater devices weren't just controlling local wave patterns. They were connected to a regional system that could influence ocean conditions across hundreds of miles of Maine coastline. Weather modification equipment designed to control storm patterns, tidal variations, even the timing of fog banks and coastal weather systems. The cottage was positioned within a controlled oceanic environment where natural weather patterns had been replaced by artificial systems designed for surveillance and communication purposes. But what disturbed me most was discovering that the wave-based transmissions were becoming predictive. The Morse code patterns started including information about financial decisions I was planning to make or personal communications I was considering sending. Like the surveillance system was monitoring my thoughts and intentions, then broadcasting predictions about future activities through ocean wave timing. Seventh week, I tried to understand the scope of the oceanic manipulation program. The controlled wave patterns weren't just affecting my cottage. They were part of a comprehensive coastal modification system that influenced weather and ocean conditions throughout the region. Other coastal residents were apparently experiencing similar phenomena, though most probably attributed unusual wave patterns to normal oceanic variation. The entire Maine coast had been converted into a controlled environment where natural ocean processes had been replaced by artificial systems designed for surveillance and communication. Around the 8th week, the weather manipulation capabilities became more obvious. Instead of just controlling wave timing, the system started creating artificial storm patterns. Localized fog banks that would appear and disappear on schedule. Even lightning strikes that occurred during clear weather conditions. The oceanic modification network could control regional weather patterns, using coastal storms and atmospheric effects for surveillance and communication purposes. But the artificial weather was becoming increasingly threatening. Storm patterns that seemed designed to prevent departure from the controlled coastal area. Fog banks that would obscure navigation routes. Even lightning strikes that damaged communication equipment and vehicle electrical systems. Someone was using weather modification to trap residents within the surveillance zone, ensuring continued participation in the Oceanic Intelligence Gathering Program. When I tried to leave the area, my GPS showed impossible navigation data, coordinates that placed the cottage in different time zones, or even different hemispheres. The surveillance system included navigation manipulation designed to prevent accurate location tracking or communication with outside authorities. Around week 9, I encountered other coastal residents who seemed aware of the weather modification program. When I tried to discuss the unusual wave patterns and storm manipulation, they said they were participants in a coastal research program studying ocean atmosphere interactions. "It's legitimate environmental research," one of them explained. "We're helping scientists understand how coastal weather systems respond to climate change." But when I asked for details about the research organization or safety protocols, they became evasive. The Oceanic Modification Program was apparently recruiting both voluntary and involuntary participants for weather control experiments and surveillance studies. I eventually escaped during a brief period when the artificial storm systems were inactive, driving inland until I reached areas with normal GPS coverage and communication capability. But throughout the evacuation, I could see unnatural lightning patterns in my rearview mirror, electrical storms that formed geometric patterns in the sky, like someone was using atmospheric manipulation to create visible signals. The Oceanic Surveillance Network included atmospheric control capabilities that could create artificial lightning displays for communication or intimidation purposes. A month later, I received contact from researchers claiming to study coastal weather patterns and their effects on human behavior. They offered payment for participation in long-term environmental studies at isolated coastal locations. But when I researched the organization, I found connections to military contractors and weather modification programs that used oceanic manipulation for behavioral control studies. The Maine coastal cottage was apparently part of a larger research network, studying how weather and ocean condition manipulation could influence human behavior and residential patterns. I learned to pay attention to oceanic patterns that seem too organized to be natural, especially when those patterns appear to contain coded information or demonstrate artificial timing. Some waves are better left unheard.